Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I am Ahmed Ragab. I'm Richard T. Watson Assistant Professor of Science and Religion, and I'm the Faculty Chair of the Science, Religion, Culture program. And first I want to welcome you all here in the Divinity School. This is such a wonderful event for us, and we're very happy to have you all.
But I wanted to share with this group.
Yeah.
They see our display of urbanism, spirituality, and well-being, as a monogram by which we have come together. And I thought I wanted to share a bit. I don't know whether you mentioned much of this at the Abbey, but I wanted to share about how this came to be.
Right.
And your reflections on it, because I didn't know you before this year.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about your program on science and religion.
So the program on Science, Religion, and Culture, we are actually at the end of our first year. The program is supported by a gift of the late Richard T. Watson. Part of this gift supports my own salary, and the other supports the other part supports the food and coffee here. So, the program started as a scholarly initiative that intends to bring together different scholars from around the university and from outside the university to discuss different questions about science, religion, and culture. And the idea was to move beyond the old discussions of science and religion, contradiction or reconciliation, into further discussions about how these two cultural structures interact with one another in order to produce the world as we know it today. And the goal of this discussion, or of all our initiatives, is really not to think about or to talk about who wins the battle, because we don't think that this is really an accurate representation of anything, but how these different types of thinking or different paradigms of thought do interact in our daily lives in order to create our society, and how can we make these things better. So, and we have a number of events we discuss. We work on questions related to religion, medicine, and health. We obviously talk about spirituality and well-being and urbanism, and that's what we're going to talk about today more. We also have events about religion, science, and sexuality, and questions about ethics. We have events about that as well. So you can sign up for our newsletter. That's my sales pitch for today. Now, for the urbanism, spirituality, and well-being, my involvement and the involvement of the program came after I was introduced to the idea by my friends and colleagues Nader Ardalan and Harvey Cox, who came and told me about this project, this idea of discussing questions related to spirituality, religion, and how it affects urbanism and architecture, and how can we think about the future of our cities and how we can make them more conducive to the well-beings of people living in these cities. And I guess so that was my entry into the project.
And I just thinking as you were talking that your divinity school and my school of public health are about as far away as they can be across the Harvard campus. And we are at the poles,
right.
Essentially. And how that is so wrong.
Yeah.
So we're in the medical school area in the Boston side of our campus. And in between, we find the School of Design.
Right.
With many of my colleagues, including Nader Ardalan. And that was the nexus that brought us together over things that we care about from our very different disciplines. So I am the Akira Yamaguchi Professor of Environmental Health and Human Habitation. And I think I'm the only faculty member that has human habitation in my title. And this came because I knew quite well my benefactor, Akira Yamaguchi, a Buddhist, deep philosopher, architect, builder of homes on the North Island of Hokkaido, built them to sustain multi-generations of living, where grandparents would be there for their grandchildren in the same structures that would last 100 years, built out of wood. And he grew up as a apprentice and then master architect, builder, building temples, Buddhist temples, and he transferred this into housing. So this was part of my education, getting to know him and that. But I, most recently, like you, I just became the director of the Center for Health in the Global Environment. And this center had been in the medical school, and just this past year moved to the School of Public Health, as its founder went emeritus status and then is now left. But it started with physicians like yourself, physicians who cared about the human condition in the context of global change, global environmental change. And they started this conversation that wasn't part of the lexicon, the discussion of all the issues of science, climate change science. The human health and the biodiversity and ecology was not really part of it. So this was the coming together. So you see our logos on the screen here: Science, Religion, and Culture, School of Public Health, Center for Health in the Global Environment. We also will thank our other sponsors. We have the contribution from Thomas from North Carolina State University, and your society, of course, and the Harvard University Center for the Environment, all of which have contributed to make this happen and the coming together. So, and we're so pleased that we could combine this, our third symposia, together with the activities of your society. So we thank you for doing that.
You can give everyone an idea about what we did in the previous two.
Yes, let me do that. Let me do that. Yeah. So let me start by bringing people into our activities. This will be the CNN version, for those that know what I'm talking about. I'll keep it at the headline level. If you aren't paying attention, I'll switch to the Fox News and just scream at you. Then you'll know what I'm saying. But we had a series of symposia starting in April. I guess we had a series of lunches too, where we brought faculty, not just from our school, the medical school, the law school. We really engaged the faculty and students across the campus. We had just some wonderful lunches right here, in fact, and elsewhere. But Professor David Carroso, a Mexican native himself, talked very personally and historically and scholarly about the development of Aztec cities and Aztec and Mayan civilizations, and shared with us some of the geography, but more the centralism of spirituality in the Aztec societies. As I'm looking at this figure, by the way, Eric, I thought of your talk. Where are you here? And the Sufi designs, the centrality of the religious structures and the radiating out from that. You shared that with us yesterday. Ave Maria, more modern context. I think you talked about that. Yes, you did, David. And this was very much designed. So here we see it again in Mesoamerica. And then Ahmed talked about, very interesting, looking at the medieval hospitals. And I'm sure I'm not going to say this in its full scholarly representation, but what struck me as you talked about the importance of hospice, hospitality, hospitals in medieval times, and how these served as a institution, served pilgrimages, and around that attracted other services, and people and settlements came along these pathways of migration, of pilgrimage. Really interesting perspective. Never thought of that before. And my friend Nader Adalan, who I traveled with in the Middle East, who taught me so much over this last year and a half as we conducted this study of 10 cities around the Arabian Gulf, looking at the development of these little settlements based on fishing and pearl diving and some commerce as they grew to what they are now because of oil. But we took it up to the period of 1960, 1970, when oil hadn't really been developed yet. But as we traveled, he would point out exactly what he was talking about in his lecture. All the symbolic design features of this rich architectural history of ancient cultures and even modern cultures, your Persian culture in particular, as we traveled around. I remember the day in Muscat in Oman where us and several other Harvard students that were with us took a half a day to tour this museum, and most of the students were out, you know, they had seen enough of this and they were out, and I tracked down Nader, and he's staring at this old map, and he goes, Jack, Adalan, that's my town, that's my village, and this whole section of Iran is named after him, his family. That's where I come from. So we had a great discussion, and you brought this into this about where do you feel centered? Where in this sort of the cosmology of all the things that we do in life, where do we find our center? And then that went on to some great discussion. So that started us off looking at cities of the past. And then we had two guests that joined us, one from our own School of Design, and another from UCLA, my friend Richard Jackson. Richard Jackson is the chair of environmental health in the School of Public Health at UCLA. But he also served, he's a medical doctor, he also served as chief medical officer for the state of California, and he has some great tales of the governor and working with Schwarzenegger, but really talked about how you go from science into public policy, into action, addressing these issues. He also worked at the Center for Disease Control, where under his watch and leadership, they started the first round of biomonitoring of the US population that tested metals and chemicals in our body, in our blood, in our urine, and hair samples. And now the fourth round is being planned. Some 170 chemicals and metals will be tested from that first set of 23, making what is invisible to us visible, making the implications of everything we build, do, purchase, design, does get reflected in our bodies and has implications to public health and to human health and well-being. So he's well known for his PBS series on designing healthy communities. So this is a series that's available for use in all sorts of forums. We use it in our coursework, talking about how the decisions of how we've built out our suburbs lead to excess body weight, body burden in terms of obesity. And he traced the obesity epidemic and the high dependence on automobile traffic, lack of walkability of these suburbs. Talked about taking two friends that might be just separated by a quarter of a mile, and how did they get together? Well, you check Google Maps and find the routes, and it's like a 6-mile loop to get to the other person's house because there's no access to get between these places. This actually is now makes me think of our travels in the Middle East, from Kuwait City, that has the old city, the old Fariges, and other places wiped out to have the compounds, the bungalows, the estates spread far out, high automobile dependence as these societies developed into the modern state. And it's no wonder that diabetes is at 20% or higher, as we learned from the director of the Dosman Center, occurring in these populations, and only in the last decade and a half. So the implications of design he brought forward. And then Rahul Motra talked to us about his upbringing in India and the use of religious symbols. I think it was shared with us just yesterday. These are spontaneous. They happen all over the city. The use of Hindu gods. And there'll be a corner here, or there'll be a tree that becomes a shrine in the center of a plaza. He also shared that they've also been used in wall decorations, right, the religious symbol, to keep, no one will put graffiti on a wall if it's religiously marked and symbolically designated as such. But then he got into a fascinating discussion about the Kumela. And he leads a group of some 50 students and faculty all over the school, medical school, school of public health, law school, school of design, and others, where they went to India and bared witness to this temporary city that emerges every 12 years on the banks of some sacred river. And this, what you're looking at here, is totally temporary construction. It's cloth and it's paper and it's bamboo, scaffolding, and out of this bank of the river, this sandy bar, emerges a city that at times is in tens of millions of people. And they are studying the governance, the organization, the sanitation, the health records, the commerce that comes out, the marketplaces, the use of communication systems. They found so many things to study about this temporary spontaneous occurrence that they think it might lead to how we better govern things like refugee situations that emerge in short order and things like that, and many other implications. Fascinating presentation. Well, today we will be equally so stimulating. We have a program that looks at the future urbanism. So we did the past, we did contemporary, and now we want to challenge our speakers to think with us and think forward. And we asked them to look at how does a spiritually and ecologically sustainable city support its residents. Is a broad topic to consider as they prepare their remarks for us today. And I'm thinking of, Magette, thinking of your presentation at the end of the day yesterday, where you talked about we should not stop thinking of utopia. Because once we stop thinking of utopia, we stop to challenge our imagination. And I think that rings true with the presentations that you'll hear today. So let me just introduce briefly all three, and then they will each have about a half hour, and then we'll have a panel discussion. But we're so pleased to have Dr. Alan Logan, author of Your Brain on Nature, coined the term vitamin G. I love that term, Alan. And he speaks to the medical community often about how how the contributions of the natural environment really is a health promoting. And he will talk to us about nature as a promoter of well-being in the future cities. We are joined today by Professor Julio Bermudez from Catholic University. And I think, in this age of disparities, we see it across cities, we see it across nations in the world community. And as I understand it, you're going to look at this in terms of inclusivity and how do spirituality and modernity, right? It's the term I learned from my School of Design folks. The modern city. How does this play into the future of spiritualism, well-being in the formation of these cities? And then we have Tim Beatley, Professor Beatley from University of Virginia, who is really promoting, I think, a new field of inquiry on the biophilic city. Will talk to us about nature in cities, the promise of biophilic urbanism. So with that introduction, let me welcome Dr. Alan Logan. And you will have to now pull up your presentation here. And there's water here.
Thank you very much. Before I get started, I just want to say personally how much I appreciate giving this time. Honestly, it means a lot to me. It's just like this is the second time in my own career where, people really stepped up to allow me to do something like this. Dr. Benson allowed me to come and speak to his continuing medical education courses in mind-body medicine starting in 2005. I've been doing that ever since. And just about 2 years ago, we introduced the vitamin G lecture within the medical school CME. So we're excited about that. I can't actually lay claim to coining the term. It was in Europe first, but we're trying to certainly popularize it, that's for sure, and bring the message forward.
Vitamin B1, B2,
Yes, exactly, exactly. Gee, it's all good, right? So, as Dr. Spengler mentioned, I'm actually going to sort of talk a little bit, be an appetizer in many ways for what will unfold through the rest of the day. And in particular, I will focus in on some of these medicinal aspects of nature and green space, and we'll talk about some of the emerging science of where neuroscience is actually looking at the brain while it is on nature, if you will. We'll get to that right away, and then we'll talk about some of the public health implications as well. I'll be delving into a lot of the experts' fields here as I go through my talk. So again, thank you very much for giving me the time. So the brain on nature. Now, there's been 4 of these MRI studies to date, and the long and the short of it is actually quite simple. They put these young individuals into an MRI scanner. They gave them a 2-minute block of either nature, rural scenes, or a 2-minute block of the urban built environment. And they're not stacking the deck. There's no graffiti or garbage or anything like that inside the urban built scenes, right? They're just typically bricks and mortar, glass, some street scenes, and so on. But it is not an act of contemplation, right? Because the image is being presented to these people in the MRI scanner every 1.5 seconds for the block of nature rural, and then every 1.5 seconds for 2 minutes for the urban environment, right? So essentially, you're really tapping in to the initial, the immediate, the visceral response of the brain at that image, right? Again, no time for contemplation. And what you're really trying to do here with this in many ways is to provide some sense of validation to the biophilia hypothesis, right? Which is Edward O. Wilson, a famous Harvard biologist, who stated that it's very likely that human beings have an innate, meaning it's built right into our DNA, and an emotional relationship to nature. And why wouldn't we? For 2.2 million years, our genus has been in nature, being sheltered by it, you know, clothed, sustained. Certainly we've had to run from it, and that fear is also evident as well. And we can get into that in terms of aspects of time. Professor Beatley can certainly speak better to that than I can. Not every element of nature is suitable in design. And we'll talk about that later. So what they found was that with the nature scenes, you were actually seeing an increased activity in areas of the brain associated with emotional stability, okay? And in particular, the insula, which is referred to by many neuroscientists as the love area of the brain, okay? Because not every time, but most times, when you bring in otherwise healthy adults into an MRI scanner and you show them pictures of their loved ones, or you show them pictures of their beloved pets, the insula becomes very active. That's why they call it the love area of the brain. In all of the studies, the insula was consistently activated, okay? The insula, by the way, is also associated with empathy, right? There's other research indicating that it enhanced insula activity. In fact, in those who get into contemplative exercises, mindfulness exercises, with experience, the insula becomes more active, okay? Now, that didn't happen with the urban built environment. On the flip side, the urban built environment, every study fired up the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, right? In those with anxiety and depressive disorders, in both conditions, the amygdala is more active. And as they get better through various interventions, the amygdala activity, the dial gets turned down. So it's interesting findings, right? I mean, these are the type of areas of the brain with nature that were being fired up, again, to happy faces or pleasure or positive memories and so on. There's more research coming out as well. It was just published a few weeks ago, where Scottish researchers followed a group of young adults as they transitioned in Glasgow from urban built through an urban park and back to urban built again. And it was really neat because they had wireless devices where they could look at the EEG patterns, and as they transitioned into the natural setting, the green space, sure enough, the EEG patterns changed that would be more reflective of a meditative state. There was higher alpha wave activity. So it's really neat to start to see some of these things that the neuroscience is getting on board with this, because the background to the entire discussion is we can't all assume, I know all of us together in this room are likely on the same page with this, but we can't assume that if we're trying to affect change, if we're trying to provide design policy to officials that ultimately put the stamp yay or nay on it, you need to have science to validate what it is that you're trying to say. So in some sense, it's remarkable that we would have to apply neuroscience to this type of thing, but it's critically important. Now, Robert Ulrich is a very famous scientist in this particular field. In many ways, he put it on the map. He was a geographer, actually, but he got into the effects of green space in healthcare settings and so on. And his studies got the ball rolling here. He found that if you stressed out young university students, whether on purpose at their final exam period or through having them watch fairly graphic workplace accident videos, and then they would go into one of two different rooms, and if they went into a room and viewed nature scenes, the return to normalcy of stress physiology was more rapid relative to the group who viewed the urban built environment. And there's been lots of studies that have backed that up since. Lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol in particular. And his most famous study, very briefly, may be aware of this study, and this was the famous hospital study. He collected 11 years of data at a Pennsylvania hospital, and the nice thing about that study was everyone had the same procedure. It was removal of the gallbladder, and essentially after that fairly straightforward procedure, they were either wheeled to the left or the right out of the OR into recovery. One room on one wing of the hospital had a view to a mini forest, and the other view was out the window to another red brick, right? You were essentially looking at another wing of the hospital. But the light was the same, the size of the rooms were the same, and in the end, there were shorter hospital stays in the folks that were wheeled out to the nature view. And I'm actually quite enjoying this view here because there's loads of greenery for me to have, in front of me. Less post-surgical complaints, less potent analgesics. They were using more over-the-counter stuff and less prescription medications in that group. And then my favorite part of all, because it's the dream of everyone to get out of the hospital without negative comments in your chart, is that the nurses placed less negative comments in the charts in those with the nature view. Now, there have been more studies. I don't need to read all of this verbatim. It's a fairly wordy slide, but the long and the short of this information in front of you is that there's been similar research as well, including a recent one where appendix removal that mere the presence of vegetation in the room, right? And these folks didn't know that they were manipulated this way, planted some green in the room or not, and again, it was a similar finding, faster recovery, less pain, less anxiety, and so on. So there's an application in healthcare settings, that's for sure. I'd be remiss in my little portion of today's talk if I didn't talk about Shinrin Yoku, which translates from Japanese as forest bathing, or taking in the forest air. And I had the good fortune to go to Japan and meet with all of these researchers that have been conducting this research. They've been doing it now in earnest since about 2005. They're really cranking out quite a few studies since then. And what they do is they have the subjects walk in a forest setting and do the same amount of physical activity as a comparator in the urban built environment, okay? And some of these studies have been longer. They've been weekend type studies. Some of them have just been a day and so on. And they've done now, as it says there, at least 1,000 subjects involved in these studies, various forests involved. And in the end, the results are consistent. You're seeing decreased psychological stress after the forest walk, decreased depressive symptoms, and so on, decreased hostility. You feel more vigorous, right? But they're backing it up with objective markers. They're backing it up with lower blood pressure, lower levels of the stress hormone cortisol. Here, I'll jump up a little bit, and you can see the devices. I mean, this is the sophistication of the forest studies that they're doing. This is a little gizmo that measures blood flow up to the frontal cortex, reflecting off the hemoglobin. They're bringing these out into the field, and they're showing that a forest experience changes the blood flow, again, reflective of a meditative state. And I'll back up here. You can see they're doing cortisol testing out in the street here. I know that if I was sitting in a folding chair in the street, my stress hormone would probably be up a little bit because they'll be embarrassed about it. But nevertheless, these are the type of studies that go on. Here you can see this young man in the top right chilling out on a recliner there in a city street in Tokyo. And the evidence from the physiology and so on would back up that he's in a much more relaxed state over here. So this is the type of stuff that's out there. And it's nice to see the objective application to what might seem just sort of intuitive. And again, these are some of the images as well. Just wanted you to see some of those images of how they do the studies. And they also have, very briefly, 44 forest therapy stations. Now, this is really exciting because these are legitimate, bona fide forest therapy locations. They have all sorts of criteria they put together in order to get it validated as a forest therapy location. Okay? And if the facilities are correct, and a lot of times that validation involves objective markers. They'll take 30 or 40 people out and see if they had a lowering in their stress hormones, and if all other criteria are met, well, you get that designation. And I'll tell you, in future design, I can absolutely see things like this happening. It's a wonderful, wonderful program, and it should be expanded. And you don't necessarily need to take a 2-hour trip out of the city in order to get that therapeutic benefit. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So there's also the cognitive benefits. We talked a little bit about some of the emotional, but there's cognitive benefits, and I'm not going to spend tremendous amounts of time on this. But suffice it to say that there's probably now 6 studies where they take individuals, and quite often the MO is this. Psychologists will cognitively stress these adults out, or university students. They'll give them lots of complex math equations, difficult puzzles that are almost impossible to solve, and cognitive fatigue sets in. Doesn't matter how resilient you are, you will get cognitively tired. Now, of course, in ADHD, it's very easy to cognitively fatigue young children, or even adults with ADHD. And they have done research in a similar vein, where they do this cognitive fatigue up front, and then you take one of 2 different walks. And typically the walks have lasted from 30 to 50 minutes, roughly, right? And you go out in an urban green space walk. In this case, there's a massive national park system in Seoul. It's tremendous. And they did a 50-minute walk through the urban pine forest or the downtown streets. Now, of course, the results showed the expected improvement in mood. That's not a shocker. But they also, when they went back and did the cognitive testing, they found that they were far sharper having had the walk in the green space. And again, there's been about 6 studies that are here on this. And all the references to this, by the way, are in the back. I'm not making this up off the top of my head. And if anyone at all ever wants these references, please do contact me. I do answer the emails at the yourbrainonnature.com. So this is another one worth noting. This was an evaluation of over 100 public high schools in Michigan. And up front, the researchers evaluated green out of the window, right? And they looked at the types of green, vegetation versus a mowed lawn. And they looked at that view from the primary classroom and also from the cafeteria. And they found that an individual's scholastic results on standardized state exams was higher if that student had a view to green, and not just a mowed lawn. A view to a variety, a biodiverse view, essentially, is the long and the short of it. The greater the amount of shrubs, the greater the propensity, the desire to go on to higher education. So these are the little things that go on, they aren't talked about. We already talked about ADHD, and you have the guided walk, the cognitive fatigue up front, and then you have the guided walk. So we won't spend too much time on that. There's been similar studies as well in the realm of depression, where they take folks with depression and they go on one of 2 different walks, an urban built environment or the urban park. Come back, and once again, cognition and mental health is improved after the walk. And then you have to just look at the overall pattern of green space. In an urban environment, how close you live to green space is highly associated with mental health of the individual. Okay? You see the bold right there. If you have less than 10% of green space within a kilometer of your home, you have a 25% greater risk of depression and a 30% greater risk of anxiety disorders. Okay? Because if you're here, it's very likely that you're living in so-called gray space. Right? You've got some factories around you. You've got lots of fast food retail chains, and so on. So now we're talking before about disparity, socioeconomic status disparity. So this is wordy. I'll bring it down to the nitty-gritty. The researchers, again from Scotland, looked at the amount of green space in a neighborhood, and in at-risk communities, there is a tremendous difference in the amount of green space in the communities, in at-risk communities. You can see it there at the end of this sentence. And I apologize about these slides. They are a bit wordy. But look at the bottom, the last sentence here. The green space in these neighborhoods varied by their postal code as much as 14% in one at-risk community and as high as 74% in the other. And it turned out that the green space was a variable in healthcare. It was a variable for the stress hormone cortisol. The folks who had a little bit of green space had cortisol patterns over a 24-hour period that were reflective of what you would find with someone with PTSD, of someone with anxiety disorders, of someone who's under a lot of stress. The less green space was equal to higher self-reported stress. That's the bottom line. So the self-reports of stress were being matched by the stress hormone cortisol. And very importantly, I think this is a critical finding, and it's not the first time the Scottish group has found this. They found it twice. It is true that green space is a facilitator of exercise. There's no question about it. Lots of research there. But it's more than just that. Because these guys have found that these differences in the stress hormones and so on, it's not simply a virtue of more exercise. There are other factors at play. And lastly on this topic about healthy inequality, and then we'll shift gears into the spirituality section. Am I doing okay for time?
Yes.
Okay. So, with regard to mortality, cardiovascular disease, this is a very impressive study. It's one of my favorite studies. It was published in The Lancet, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And what they found was they looked at every major metropolitan city in Scotland and England, right? They were using UK mortality data to determine risk of dying and so on. And then they looked at land use data, green space. Now, of course, as expected, the at-risk communities have a higher risk of dying early from cardiovascular disease and other chronic diseases, okay? But when they looked at how much green space was in that community, the gap was narrowed significantly, right? So if you were at risk but had lots of green space, your risk of dying was narrowed much closer to the affluent communities. And they conclude, at the bottom here, that green space is an independent variable capable of saving thousands of lives per year in low-income populations. Okay, it's a very, very important finding. We need more research, and we need to keep funneling in that direction. And just lastly, the Japanese research on the Shinrin-yoku, they're also tying it into immune benefits. If you go out into the forest for a weekend, you get improvements in your natural killer cell activity for a month later. These are your primary defenders against influenza, common cold, and cancer. When they did a day trip to a forest park, the participants had improved natural killer cell activity for a week later. So it's having an effect on the immune system as well. Now, let's shift this a bit towards this spirituality angle of things. Because awe, and I don't think we talk enough about awe as an emotion, as a medicinal agent, quite frankly. Awe can be fostered by nature. First, let's define what it is technically, according to the experts. It's a feeling of wonder experienced by the self when you face or see or soak in something that's vast, something that's greater than your current understanding, right? You can induce it. If you take 100 otherwise healthy young students, you can induce awe very easily by having them visualize nature, by having them view vistas and scenes of impressive nature. Okay? But it doesn't have to be massive. There's a perception that you can only induce awe if you show someone the Grand Canyon, right? No, it has to be beautiful, that's all. And for me, a ladybug on the end of my finger is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. To this day, it will still strike awe on me. Now, you can also induce it when there's a universal appeal to artwork. Okay? So they do these studies, and if there's a high degree of appreciation of a particular art piece, it's stunning, you can induce awe. And of course, childbirth can also, even the mere visualization or watching a film of childbirth can induce awe as well. But what it does, when you induce awe, when psychologists induce awe in someone, lo and behold, their feelings of religiosity and spirituality are increased. So it becomes this circle, right? If someone is very spiritual and they have a spiritual moment, their awe goes up, but it works the other way too, where awe, when induced, increases your feeling of spirituality. Induction of awe directs attention away from you and into the environment. Now, that environment may be to another person, or it could be to the environment as we refer to it here in terms of a sustainable environment. Okay? And there's some differences. Awe induced by nature equals increased feelings of one to all other people. You no longer see yourself as just this one individual and it's all about me. You're thinking about all of us on the planet when you induce awe. Childbirth awe tends to increase your feelings of closeness to your friends and family in particular. So there's some subtle differences that they're finding. Why is it of relevance as our cities expand, having locations and opportunities for awe? Quite frankly, it makes you a nicer person. And psychologists have looked at this as well. And they found that when you induce awe, and again, I will reiterate that psychologists use nature scenes to induce awe in these experiments, right? There's lots of references here. As I said, anyone that wants them, please contact me. It decreases impatience, right? It makes you feel like you have more time. That was one of the more impressive recent studies, that when you induce awe, I feel like I've got more time to do things. Because the opposite of that, feeling time crunched. Are you more likely, if you're feeling time crunched, are you more likely to say, oh, you go ahead, sir, no problem, right? No. The research is quite clear on this. When you feel time crunched, you hold on to your own resources. You don't share with other people. You have more depressive symptoms. The long and the short of it is you're very stressed out. And very importantly, you don't do the lifestyle, the public health activities. If you feel a time crunch, you're not going to be eating the best of foods. If you feel a time crunch, you're not going to be physically active as you know you should be. Research is quite clear on that as well. So, in some of these tests, again, awe provokes the experience, the choice of experience compared to material goods. In other words, if you induce awe, I want to get a Broadway show in terms of watch becomes more appealing. Experience becomes more appealing, right? And it provokes, even in a second, momentary life satisfaction. Okay. Now, as I said, blue space, desert-like areas, forests, they can all produce spiritual inspiration. Relatedness, wonder, oneness, right? Complete awareness of the present moment. That's what a spiritual experience is all about when it's induced by nature. And as I said here, there it is down in the fourth bullet. Induced by nature does not require, if we're expanding urban settings and talking about this, the necessity of nature and green space, we do not need to bring the Grand Canyon to the greater Boston area. It doesn't have to be that big. But the key point here is that spiritual experiences provide opportunity for further reflection and improvement in resolution of personal difficulties. And very, very importantly, the last bullet down, and this is where it starts to come full circle to sustainability and such conversations. When you feel that way, you are more likely to stand up and say, yes, I'm for the environment. I'm here to protect the environment. Now, whether it's a spiritual experience, which has been shown in the research, or whether it's your connectedness to nature, you are more likely to have subsequent pro-environmental attitudes. And that is where the research is shifting, and in my mind, not a moment too late. We need opportunity. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm feeling guilty. You got it. Sure. I want everyone to share up. And really, we're winding down. We want everyone. Opportunity is the key, right? We need to provide equitable opportunity in at-risk communities for all. That's what we're talking about here. Opportunity. And just to wind down here, nature connectivity. Psychologists have scales for this. They actually can see to what degree someone is connected to nature. And when they do that, lo and behold, they find that your overall psychological well-being, your vitality, your meaningfulness is stronger. Strong connections between nature connectivity and personal well-being are found broadly among the general population. Doesn't matter whether you're an executive, a civil servant, a student, the scientists have found that this exists for all of us. And again, as I mentioned, the higher you score on your connectedness to nature scale, the more likely you are to have pro-environmental attitudes as well. And mindfulness and contemplation is the bridge here, right? So we've discussed quite a bit of research, from MRIs to land use data and so on. But here, today, contemplation, mindfulness, Canadian researchers found among their students, it was a group of 450 university students, and they found, yeah, there is a connection between your connection to nature and your health. But the higher that these folks scored on mindfulness, that was the bridge. That was what took it to being significant, highly significant, right? So, in the end, the relationship between connection to nature and psychological resilience, it's mediated by experience, and we need to afford opportunity for experience. My last slide here is pro-social aspirations. And this is from Dr. Richard Ryan, who's done wonderful studies in this area, brilliant man. And he found that when he got his students to visualize nature, right, they were more willing to share. You know how the psychologists, they set up these experiments to determine how much of your monopoly money or whatever you would share to your other participants? When they visualized nature, or when they saw scenes of nature, they were more likely to share. And then he upped the ante. He actually put 4 plants in a room, 2 potted plants on the floor and a couple around the desk. And they had no idea. These young students came into the room. They have no idea they're being manipulated this way. And all of a sudden, more pro-environmental attitudes, of course, but subsequent sharing and generosity. So that's the notion here. That all of this, there's a broad conversation. And I've just given an appetizer here, and I hope that it sets the table for many of the conversations that will unfold for the rest of the day. And I'm excited about it myself. So thank you very much.
I think we have Julio next. Yes. We're going to hold questions. It'll take him a while to come down and set up, ask you a question, then I'll make a comment.
Here's an idea to turn it around.
Can you bring my slide, please? Yeah. Come over to this.
Sure.
And you can load up your.
I can set it up.
Yes.
Here's an idea to turn it around. Understanding the positive values of nature and being in nature. Much of what we use to define us has to do with conflict. The degree to which we engage in conflict, avoid conflict. Much of that definition becomes much stronger because of being with other people and the things that we create. All filled with ego. And it becomes a state of our definition of who we are based on our need to protect our ego against everyone else. The wonder of being in nature is that nature has no ego. So it becomes less of a positive, an affirmation of being in that place, than it is the matter of being able to avoid the things that require us to protect ourselves. We're able to wear less clothing. We have fewer layers
to cover ourselves, to give us that sense of that protection. In nature, we could just be who we are without that defining quality.
Quick response. Julio is now set up to talk, so we'll just do a quick response, if any.
Well, it's just, yeah, I totally agree with you. It's more of a comment, and I appreciate it, and there's no argument on my end of it, without a doubt. The ego certainly gets in our way, for sure.
Your last point about the using nature to inspire and to change mindsets. We, early on in our collaborations, we met with David Eisenberg at alternative medicine at the medical school. He said, you know, interesting, therapists invoke images of nature to bring people into a hypnotic state, whether it's ocean, water, trees, forests, but this is the common that brings people into the sharing state. Right?
That's right.
Yeah, so thanks. Julio, you're all set to go.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to Tom and Nadir and to Jack and Harvey and Hamed. I think it's also very excited to be here as an ACS group. We founded this 7 years ago with a few of us, and to come here today together from people all over the world is kind of humbling and exciting, and hopefully I could share something of value with you. So. Looking at today's civilization, we can't help ourselves but marvel at the human accomplishments. Yes, we have done remarkable deeds in science and technology, in the arts, insight and compassion, in food and shelter, in health and medicine, in education and communication. And all these and so many others combined have brought an era of prosperity of such wealth and scale never before experienced by humankind. This story is one of human successes, and of course it's just one-sided. For there is another darker side. Who can forget the challenges of unprecedented scale, speed, and our kind we are facing? The list is long and overwhelming. Massive environmental pollution, and destruction, global warming, and climate change. Large number of people live in abject poverty, xenophobia and discrimination, global terrorism, wars, exponential population growth, runaway consumerism fueled by unconscious greed and materialism, accelerating technological and scientific breakthroughs of uncertain yet vast impact. And all this happening in the context of media anesthetized societies oblivious to it all. Looking into the future returns an impending civilizational cliff with significant threats to the welfare, health, and even existence of vast numbers of human and non-human beings. The situation is the last stage of a process of rationalization, objectification, secularization, industrialization, urbanization, and more started by modernity roughly 200 years ago. The tragedy of our predicament is not only that it ethically undermines the very way of life that we have come to expect, but worse, it fails to fulfill us despite its huge cost. Quite simply, it is hard to find meaning in the fragmented, materialistic, skeptical, market-driven, and analytical reality of modernity. Postmodern intelligence has offered plenty of critique of modernity, but have done little to change the situation. At best, it has served as a diagnostic tool. At worst, is the constructivist examination of subjective agency, metaphysical depth, bureaucratic power, and language in conjunction with the disengaged and tautological stand has landed us into nihilism, cynicism, and relativism, which insidiously pushes back into modernity, exacerbating its ruling. Not surprising, Many now use terms such as hypermodernity and supermodernity to describe our times, which return us to where we were in the conversation. At heart, the sickness of our time, of modernity, is a crisis of meaning. It is perhaps for this reason that in spite of, or because of, the power and spread of modernity, religion continues to be the ethical, existential, and aesthetic compass to life's meanings for most people around the globe. For example, a 2012 Wynne Gallup International Poll on Religiosity and Atheism concluded that 59% of the world population is religious. 23% are non-religious but do not call themselves atheists, suggesting an openness to a non-organized spiritual belief or practice. And only 13% report to be atheist. In other words, we seem to be dwelling in two seemingly irreconcilable realities at once. One in which we successfully run our everyday businesses insensitive to its unconscionable cost, and the other that provides us with meaning based on faith, values, and practice of a metaphysical world. With no space for a significant engagement of religion, modernity make us incapable of addressing today's huge problems because at their root, they demand that we acknowledge and deal with the ultimate meaning, wholeness, and transpersonal nature of reality and all its beings. Without some openness to modernity, religion remains stuck in regressive perspectives and practices that are inappropriate or counterproductive to face the challenge of the 21st century. Resolving our quandary demands us to somehow reconcile the schizophrenic dichotomy by building bridges between modernity and religion, something easier said than done. How do we do it? I will argue that we must begin moving from modernity towards religion instead of the other way around, for three reasons. First, because we are operating under modernity's command, and in order to effect civilizational change, we must work within it. Second, since modernity is in the strongest position, it is more likable to listen and adjust. Third, modernity has historically proven to be more flexible than religion, especially if presented with empirical and rational evidence. Working for modernity outwards means that we have to use its methods, rules, and language to approach spirituality, namely science. Today's widely agreed method to validate all types of claims and hypotheses, and therefore a central power broker in all important decisions affecting us. Needless to say that the burden of scientific proof is difficult when dealing with matters of spirituality, but one that, if lifted, will surely build the so necessary connections between religion and modernity. Only through some of these new connections we will find the meaning necessary to proactively engage our traveling world. Which brings us to the symposium topics, urbanism, spirituality, and well-being. Let me start by saying that bridging modernity and religion via science has already begun, and Alan has shown some example of that. Over the past 2 decades, medical research has been finding a wide range of positive effects that active spiritual beliefs and practices have in human health and well-being. In this talk, I will look at one particular example, contemplative and meditative practices. As we know, most spiritual traditions teach the importance of and centrality of contemplative practice. For example, Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, but also Catholic-centered prayer, transcendental meditation, and yoga. In this slide, you can see the growth in the number of grants and publications covering the impact of contemplative practices in human health and well-being. It's remarkable. Perhaps the most well-known example are the neuroscientific studies of meditation done on Tibetan monks, many of them at the Center for Affective Science in Wisconsin, or the 30-year-old University of Massachusetts Medical School Center for Mindfulness. These scientific efforts, along many others in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience, have been building a solid empirical evidence that contemplative practices significantly improve, and again Alan says some of this, cognitive and affective performances, enhance immunological response, foster brain growth and plasticity, provide a better sense of well-being, reduce stress, depression, loneliness, and anxiety, increase motivation, and raise pain thresholds. So successful and impressive the scientific finding being that hundreds of centers around the world now offer mindfulness-based therapies for a variety of disorders. The US military is actively investigating such practices for combat performance improvement and PTSD treatment, Politicians began to include the topic in the national agenda. Schools are slowly adopting them in their curriculum. Prisons are offering to the inmates, and there is a growing number of individuals and groups devoted to the practice of meditation. The big question is whether or not the results of a scientific experiment with a small number of people apply to very large groups. The hope is that deploying these spiritual practices widely will move large parts of humanity towards better mental, physical, social, and spiritual health, and in so doing, begin to respond to our civilizational challenges. However, I believe this is wishful thinking likely to fail. I'm sorry for that. We know that active religious and spiritual practice are difficult to implement and maintain for multiple reasons. They take time, discipline, and effort, may require training and company, are usually kept within the realm of the individual and or small communities, and highly spread across society, and necessitate continued environmental, that is social, physical, and cultural reinforcement as they go against today's way of life. In other words, even if we had a modern world receptive to a scientifically proven religious wisdom, we would have a hard time to spiritualize modernity using traditional religious methods alone, particularly at a large scale. It is here where the power of the built environment may prove valuable, because it is the stage set that supports or discourages certain beliefs and practices at a large scale. In this sense, let us recognize that today's cities are hardly an oasis or expression of spiritual values and practices. This is because our cities, regardless of their foundation date, are mostly the result of urban developments occurred over the past 100 years that followed the vision of modernity. A major shift in urban design and planning to advance spirituality could, at least theoretically, have huge beneficial repercussions. But can the built environment really nudge people into experiential states alike to those gained through spiritual practice, and thus provoke similar health and well-being benefits? Existing scientific literature, mostly produced by evidence-based design research, do not respond to this question directly, as they cover issues other than spirituality, especially in architecture, like in healthcare, working productivity, energy efficiency. Now, I would like to share with you, from now until the end of the lecture, my research effort to address this relationship between architecture and spirituality. Until recently, this area of study was very much avoided because its phenomenological nature, that is, its highly qualitative, internal, and subjective nature, seemed intractable or opaque to the scientific method. In order to move forward, I developed two projects. First, I expanded phenomenological traditional method of small-scale self-observation and hermeneutics to include a very large number of experiential accounts. This meant to design and conduct a survey to produce data that could be statistically analyzed. Second, and following the survey results, I used neuroscience to look at what is happening in the brain when people experience contemplative spaces. Following, I will show these two projects briefly. 5 years ago, I conducted a year-long survey on extraordinary architecture experiences. The goal was to collect sufficient testimonies to empirically map the nature of profound, transformative, ascetic, contemplative phenomenologies of our built environment. The survey, one in English and the other one in Spanish, took place over the internet and asked participants 35 specific as well as open-ended questions about extraordinary architecture experiences that they may have had in their lives. An extraordinary experience of architecture was defined. You can read it. The questionnaires took about 10 to 15 minutes to complete and guaranteed participants' confidentiality. The survey produced the largest number of personal testimonies of such profound experiences ever collected, around 2,900 altogether. The responses statistically showed remarkable consistency in how people physically, intuitively, intellectually, and emotionally responded to extraordinary buildings and places. Survey answers provided unmistakable indication of a not knowledge-seeking, non-judgmental, and aesthetic phenomenology, and consequently results Results that, like the rest of the survey, show strong statistical parallels in Spanish and English-speaking populations. For example, here are responses to questions about the characteristics and outcomes of these remarkable events. Given the focus of this talk, we don't have time to go into details. But suffice it to say that the nearly 2,900 responses provided clear evidence that extraordinary experiences of architecture were all about contemplative states and involved a strong spiritual component. And not just that. Looking at the top 10 buildings or places that provoke profound experiences, we found not only well-known places to architects and the public in general, but also, and very relevant to our conversation here, that most of these buildings were architectures designed with contemplation in mind: religious, spiritual contemplation, ascetic contemplation, or symbolic contemplation. In short, the survey showed that architecture may be successfully designed to induce strong, transformative, contemplative states. However, even with the statistics in our side, our modern world continued to resist declaring these experiences as ultimately subjective and therefore impossible to generalize. This situation made us wonder if we couldn't use neuroscience to provide more harder evidence, an area of growing interest but little development in our discipline. I'm talking architecture itself, not other things. Given our focus on deep phenomenological states, we frame the question like this: do buildings designed for contemplation elicit brain activation similar to those found during contemplative states? In other words, can an external method to induce contemplation, in other words, architecture, produce results similar to those attained using conventional internal, prayer, meditation methods? If we could show that architecture might, then the many beneficial effects of contemplative practices that we saw could be extended to exposure to careful design environments. Better still, we could begin to help spiritualize modernity, which is in the end our ultimate goal. With all this background in mind, we conducted a pilot study using fMRI technology at the Utah Brain Institute. Our project investigates which brain regions are activated when people are presented with visual images of contemplative buildings versus ordinary or non-contemplative buildings. Our experimental block, Block B, consisted in showing subject visual images of 5 buildings said to induce contemplative states, and these were selected from the survey. We used 2 controls. Our first control, Block A, came from showing the same subjects images of 5 ordinary buildings not designed to elicit contemplative responses. The other control came from the neuroscience literature covering subjects either undergoing meditation or seeing aesthetic objects. We recruited 12 architects for the experiment, a number commonly used in pilot studies in neuroscience. The choice of architects as subjects follow a rationale similar to selecting expert meditators to demonstrate the power of meditation in the laboratory. In our case, architects are most likely to have the strongest and thus measurable response to building than the average citizen. Protocol-wise, participants were instructed to enter an experiential state that involved non-analysis or judgment. We included 2 questionnaires. One was given after each block and consisted of 3 self-assessment questions addressing levels of anxiety, presentness, and internal dialogue or inner chatter. The second questionnaire was done after finishing the fMRI study, was 15 minutes long, and included questions about a variety of issues, as you can see in the slide. Let us move to the results now. A visual summary of the responses to 4 questions of the exit interview show unmistakable distinction between the control and the experiment being consistent to the type of responses found in the large survey discussed earlier, proposing a state of mind that was aesthetic and contemplative. Responses to another 4 exit questions were used to map the type of attention deployed during each block. As we can see, there is again very obvious differences where the control block induced a distracted and inwardly directed attention. The experiment overwhelmingly provoked absorbed and outwardly focused conscious states. Let us now look at the brain. Let me say that these results are just coming out of the data, so this is quite new stuff. haven't showed it really. And these are, I want to show 12 of 68 studies we are working on. In our first exhibit here, we see the activation of the whole brain in comparison to the baseline. Control and experiment blocks show similar and even overlapping activated areas corresponding to the premotor functions, which is the middle frontal gyrus and the adjacent Brodmann area 6, and visual processing. While there are some differences, what matters here are the commonalities, as they emphasize what is unique to the architecture experience in general, vision and movement. That is, an embodied and perceptually rich state of awareness and being. In other words, a conscious experience of architecture is the result of a physical, spatial, temporal, sensorial, and physical presence rather than a pure inward intellectual act. These results are consistent with neuroaesthetics in painting and sculpture, but go beyond. A contrast analysis of whole brain activation between control and experiment present activation of the left and right parietal lobes during the experimental block. This suggests a synthetic integration of multiple senses that may be associated with the aesthetic experience of beauty. And given a lesser frontal cortex activation, basically very, very little or none, we may account for the experiential absorption, less inner chatter, and outwardly directed attention reported in the exit interview. In contrast, the control shows differential activation of the middle frontal gyrus, this BA9, and the right cerebellum, a reasonable outcome for responding to ordinary buildings. We show schools, and office, and shopping mall that have fixed and therefore demand a social cultural code of behavior vis-a-vis spatial, material, formal cues. Subjects needed to activate executive function to make perceptual go and no-go decision based on the what, when, and where of the scene. In terms of self-assessment, subjects had made a statistically significant agreement that contemplative buildings reduce their anxiety and mind wandering, a result consistent with moving from an ordinary mental state to one of contemplation. We found that anxiety produced a strong yet dissimilar effect in the control and experiment blocks. In the experiment, the more anxiety, the less emotional and motivational executive engagements, there, the Brodmann area 25, and the less spatial processing, attention, and reflective awareness, BA7, thus subverting contemplation. In the control, higher anxiety reduced premotor planning functioning, weakens the place recognition area, this is the parahippocampal gyrus, it's an important area for architects actually, interfered with the synchronization and integration of multiple sensory perception, the clustering, and subverts interoceptive awareness and related emotional reaction, the insula, we just heard about that. In short, anxiety weakens the architecture experience in general and undermines the possibility of attaining contemplative states, even in places known to do so. Regarding internal dialogue, mind wandering, which is the anti-meditation state, we found that, like anxiety, it interferes with both the experience of architecture and the onset of contemplative states. This latter is something well known in neuroscience and all meditative traditions. In the experiment, mind wandering, inner chatter, inhibited the scenic engagement as seen in the parahippocampal gyrus. Diminished conscious spatial processing, attention, and reflective awareness, Brodmann area 7, while interfering with sensory motor processing and consciousness regulation, the thalamus. In the control, inner chatter also reduces spatial processing and attention and reflective awareness, BA7, and undercut activation of reward seeking and motor planning, the substantia nigra. Based on subject responses to all our questions and using the parameters listed in this slide, we rank our subject depth of experience. The ranking goes from subject having a shallow and intellectual response to the experiment, that is on our right, to very, very deep, absorbed, emotional, and satisfying experiences. What we wanted to see was if there was any correlation between this variability in phenomenological responses or contemplative state and brain activation. Using such ranking of subjects, we did a regression analysis and found a progressive massive deactivation of the brain the deeper the reported experiences. This is something also described in neuroscience literature on meditation and certain peak states. Specifically, the more profound the architecture experience, the less activation of, and this is a list of no activation because nothing going here. Less activation of the prefrontal cortex, BA8, 9, 10, and 6, associated with executive function, sense of self or ego, analysis, and so on. Less activation of the posterior cingulate gyrus, considered the central component in the default model network. We could talk more about that. That's also a profound finding. Less activation of superior temporal gyrus, concerned with auditory experiences, which in this case makes sense, and less activation of inferior parietal lobe, associated at least in part with linguistic processing, calculation, and deductive reasoning. All the results are in line with the biological signature of contemplative state. On the other hand, notice the deeper the experience, the greater the activation of zone related to embodiment, visuality, and sensory integration. These results suggest a type of contemplative state different from those attained using internally induced states. And the last example of the neuroscience here, most of the literature on neurasthenic pays great attention to the orbitofrontal cortex, given its central role in aesthetic judgment. However, we do know that contemplative practices foster non-evaluative or open and accepting conscious states. This is exactly what we got. Judgment during the control phase and non-evaluative activation during the experiment, consistent with the possibility that our subject were in a contemplative state. Conclusion. The result of our neuroscientific study, which are still finalizing, make us provisionally conclude that 1. Substantially distinct neurofindings occur when subjects experience ordinary versus contemplative buildings. 2. Contemplative buildings stimulate embodiment, sensory integration, non-evaluative operation, and experiential absorption, as well as reduce anxiety and internal dialogue, while deepening experiences through a massively deactivated frontal cortex. 3. That the attained state may be considered contemplative, even though it is gained through external and aesthetic means and appears to be like and unlike contemplative states attained through traditional means of internally processing. And 4, we can claim, provisorily at least, pending further study, that architecture designed to arouse spiritual sensibility may indeed promote health and well-being. So, this is the parting words. Although the 2 studies considered individual buildings and not urban settings, they do suggest the possibility that the design of urban environment may support, if not advance, spiritual sensibility, and in so doing also further human health and well-being at a larger scale. This is significant because much urbanized and architectural development is to occur in the next decades as a result of the rapid population growth and urbanization underway. The resulting increase in human density will either exacerbate the already dangerous negative trends of today or help to combat them if appropriate design and planning actions are taken. In short, the city is where the success of the human expanding will be decided. Thus, if there is a solution to our crisis, it will have to be found, tried, and be successful in the city. One slide. These arguments lead me to argue that at least one of the future for all of us here today is to participate in a constructive dialogue, in constructing a dialogue between religion and modernity, through the scientific study of the relation between the built environment and spirituality. Whereas much can be said about using spiritual values as arguments for directing urban policies and development towards, for example, sustainability, social equality, or beauty, we must recognize that it is a much better strategy to resort to science to accomplish our goal. Simply put, empirical data will always have more power than logical or moral arguments in getting a receptive hearing from modernity. The last one. The irony should not be lost nonetheless. Ever since the Enlightenment, Western civilization witnessed the progressive escalation in the struggle between science and religion to occupy the central role in the explanation and guidance in our world. While science came as a clear victor, we now find ourselves humbly returning to religion for meaning and insight to guide our way out of the fallout from science's triumph. If successful, the ensuing spiritualization of modernity will start a new, a more integral and meaningful way of life that mitigate, if not avert, the otherwise bleak future of all being on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation in conjunction with Alan's. I mean, to think that there are multiple pathways to accomplish the contemplative state within urban form. This was really, really nice. Professor Beatley, will you come up and join us? Could we have some assistance in getting that plugged in? But before you go, Julio, I'm struck by the fact that you did not include lefties, left-handed architects, and I just have to ask you why. The handwriting is poor or something?
The question of selecting subjects, just to discuss the methodology, take an hour. Of course, I'm not a science, so I'm working with 4 or 5 people on this. Okay, so the brain is very different from a left-handed from a right-handed. It's very different, which we know, male from females. It's very different if you're a native speaker or not. And there is in order to get enough consistency in a group of 12 people, which is a small number, but it's still significantly, statistically significant, you have to produce this section. So it's a pilot study, and the hope will be, of course, now, with this result, with the publication that we'll have, is that we can get some funding and we could extend that to other groups and non-architects, of course.
When we think of the great urbanization that's going on around the world in China and India, should we be exploring ethnic differences?
Absolutely.
Lot to do.
Yes.
Your presentation, I found myself thinking about my experiences with Akira Yamaguchi, and he had come up with this new home design in Hokkaido, and I was there with him. I said, fantastic, we can bring in our environmental measurements, we can measure the air pollution, the lighting, the acoustics, and he's shaking his head. And I said, well, how else should we be approaching this? He goes, well, live in it. That's all he said. I will know because I will live in it, and I will understand what it means.
Yeah, the challenge I think we have, and I think that's what Alan was saying. I mean, we're preaching to the choir. We know that this is real and it's true. The question is, when you walk out of this place, they don't. Or the market-driven economy will not believe this. So we need this, I don't believe consciousness or spirit is in the brain. It's ridiculous. It's not there. But that's the tool we have today to convince people of what is intuitively natural to most of us. Otherwise, they will not buy into the argument. And so it's a tool.
But was it hard in eras past? I mean, Olmsted, did he have to make this argument in an economics context?
But modernity had not taken over. I mean, it's too late for, unfortunately. So it's a different game now. So we need these things. We really do.
Thank you. Are we ready?
We're ready now.
Thank you. Please come forward. I think you were just at arrival when I read the title of the talk, Nature in Cities, The Promise of Biophilia in Urbanism. So we're happy to have Professor Tim Beatley with us today.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, it's great to be here. And great to hear the previous 2 presentations. Just fantastic work. And I hope there'll be some connections between what I'm talking about and those 2 talks. There clearly will be an Alan. I think we'll I've got some slides actually that cover a little bit of the same ground, but not in as much detail and not as articulately as yours. So I have been talking about this idea of biophilic cities. Sometimes I say biophilic urbanism. So combining the biophilia and the urbanism together. And so we've got something called the Biophilic Cities Project. Let's see. Is this going? Am I not advancing in the right way? I don't need to point this way. Oh, point it up that way. Point it up that way. It does. No? It's not working. Blow on. Blow on. If there's, I don't have a machine to
we'll have a human in between.
Yeah, really? Okay. That may be a little hard to do because I have this habit of going back and forth and doing all kinds of funny things. But and there's a second part to that. Go ahead and advance. This often happens in my lectures where the battery goes dead just at the right time. So there is a little book called Biophilic Cities that was mentioned, and I'm going to try to go fast through these slides and tell you about what cities are doing. Oh, great! An actual keyboard. Yay, that works. And then I'll go back. Yeah, marvelous. So if you end up wanting a little bit more information about some of the cities and some of the ideas, there is this little book, Biophilic Cities. I'm also going to tell a few stories from a documentary film that we've just done called The Nature of Cities that has been playing on PBS stations, and kind of a visceral demonstration of some of the concepts of nature and cities. So there are some resources. So this is really the challenge for me that we've been trying to tackle. How can we imagine, most of us in urban planning, sustainable urbanism, imagine cities that are going to be denser and compact. We want them to be those ways. We want them, if we really need to move in the direction of sustainability, we want to create cities where it's possible to walk and where we're investing in public transit and compact urban form that has a much smaller carbon footprint and profoundly uses less energy. So we want cities. We're celebrating cities, and we're not going to shift, of course. We're moving down a global urban path. But how do we also incorporate that nature that we increasingly know we need? So thus this Biophilic Cities project, this is a screenshot of the webpage, and I'd love for everyone to take a look. It's www.biophilic.cities.org. And we have a weekly blog and a monthly e-newsletter, and if you want to learn more, add your name and we'll send you. There's one coming out just this week about insects in cities in honor of cicadas. So we love cicada. We have lots of cicada essays. Anyway, there's a page about each of our partner cities. So much of this project is about exploring what is a biophilic city, what does it look like, feel like, what could it be like, what could a future city be, and then partner cities around the US and around the world. And we're getting ready actually for a big launch event, conference in October at the University of Virginia, and there's a little bit of information about that on the webpage if anyone's interested, October 17th to 20th. Where we're going to come together and think about what the future agenda really needs to be. So, already mentioned E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson here at Harvard, who's a hero for a lot of us, wasn't the first person to use the term biophilia, but he really did coin it in the sense the way we use it today, which is this idea, of course, that we've co-evolved with nature. We've lived in that natural setting, that we're carrying with us our ancient brains. And it's not a big surprise that we are happier and healthier and more productive in the presence of nature. So this is one of Ed Wilson's definitions, biophilia, the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. Innate means hereditary and hence part of ultimate human nature. So we are hardwired to need that connection with nature. And our argument is that it's not something that you can get on a holiday in the summer. That you might do that, and you might have a terrific immersive event, immersive week or two or month. But the nature that we need has to be around us. It has to be all around us. It has to be the everyday nature. It's the nature that you're experiencing daily, hourly, and the nature that we're seeing behind this building right now. It has to be with us. It has to be around us. And to be truly happy and healthy and to live meaningful lives, we do need that nature. Now, Alan's talked about forest bathing. I just love the terminology, the English translation, the idea of forest bathing, that you walking through a forest and the dappled light and the colors and the bird sounds, and that's a kind of experience. And having that in the city is not a big surprise, of course, when you see stress hormone levels going down, and as you nicely talked about, the boost to our immune system. So there are clearly health implications. I sometimes talk about the natural social capital building capabilities of nature. So these two women on the left are featured in our documentary film, and we spent a day with them. They're two amateur wildlife trackers, urban wildlife trackers. So they've actually gone to school to learn the finer distinctions, to recognize. They can tell you, they can distinguish between a paw track of a domestic cat versus a bobcat, which we actually went looking for on the day that we filmed them. And it's a marvelous story. They have a very special friendship. We followed them around. We actually tried to keep up with them. They're in a place called Rose Canyon, one of the beautiful canyons in San Diego, kind of left over. Remarkable biodiversity in that city. Well, at a certain point we couldn't keep up with them, and at one point they went off the trail into the bushes, and we didn't know where they were until we heard this yelping, happy sound that they had discovered some blood on a branch. and thought that they had just been minutes away from seeing the resident female bobcat, which is what we were doing. That's the kind of excitement that nature in the city can invoke, and the kind of awe and wonder that these two women had. But perhaps more importantly, this canyon serves as a context, a space for bringing together people and for forming friendships. Nature's not the only way that can happen, but it is uniquely suited for that. And as we know, deeper and more extensive friendships and social relations help us to, in many other ways. There are clear health benefits to having friendships. We know mortality rates go down for cancer, for instance.
Does the frog share these experiences?
The frog is, yes, we won't talk about the frog, that's part of the natural system. But these women will tell you that the neighborhoods surrounding the canyons are interesting, are diverse, and some are higher density housing sort of neighborhoods, some are single-family detached neighborhoods. They all come together in this canyon. They're neighbors who would probably not otherwise be interacting, and they've recently come together in an effort to protect the canyon, in fact. So we know that nature can have that ability, has that ability to bring us together. A lot of evidence about the impact of urban greening in healing urban spaces and addressing urban ills. This is a study from the American Journal of Epidemiology, year before last, showing, looking at places, neighborhoods in Philadelphia where they've planted trees, and again, not a big surprise, maybe compared with vacant lots, compared with those neighborhoods where tree planting didn't occur. In those green neighborhoods, they have seen a pretty significant reduction in gun assaults, gun violence, and vandalism. And also the greening of vacant lots associated with residents reporting less stress and more exercise. Not a big surprise either, that nature has this ability to bring us outside and to actually engage in physical activity and be with others, again, back to the social realm. And Philly actually has done some pretty remarkable things to green their urban environments. They have a long way to go, but one of the really interesting programs is the Philly Orchard Project, where they have been working with neighborhoods to help plant community-based orchards, and then to teach the neighbors how to maintain and manage those spaces. And they are located in neighborhoods that have some amount of food insecurity, and they become an important kind of green feature in the neighborhood as well. So there are a lot of reasons for us to think about how nature can be integrated into the core of urban design and planning. Another story from our documentary film, the amazing story in Austin, Texas. Some of you know about it. A few years ago, when they were renovating the main bridge that runs through the city of Austin, the Congress Avenue Bridge, and discovered that a large number of Mexican free-tailed bats came during the summer, they're migratory, and occupied the spaces underneath the bridge. The first reaction, of course, of the city of Austin, I say of course, it shouldn't have been this way, but this is a hazard, a public hazard. We have to eradicate the bats. And it set in motion a very interesting discussion. This fellow, Merlin Tuttle, founder of Bat Conservation International, actually moved BCI to Austin, Texas, and almost single-handedly shifted the attitude about the bats in that city. And the story really of a city that's moved quite dramatically in the direction of becoming a biophilic city. So instead of eradicating the bats, 1.5 million Mexican free-tailed bats now come every year. They're celebrating the bats. And so people line up on the Congress Avenue Bridge, and there's a viewing area below the bridge to watch the emergence of these bats at sundown. And so I show this slide in part because there are pretty clear economic benefits to having nature in cities. Millions of dollars in tourism revenue, actually, for the city of Austin. There are 2 or 3 or 4 bat-watching dinner cruises that go up and down the lower Colorado River. The city of Austin has named their hockey team after the bats now. You could say that Austin's gone a little bit bat crazy. But a very, very good way, a very good story, and contrasts with other cities. Alan already mentioned this. We're actually both fans of Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester, who has done this amazing work. I think nature can make us better human beings. I think this experimental work showing that in the presence of nature, people exhibit more generous behavior, greater generosity, is pretty compelling. The critter on the right is a sulfur-crested cockatoo who, when we lived for a while in Sydney, Australia, and we moved into this apartment building, and almost on the first day, this flock came to our balcony and wanted to know how generous we were going to be. But it wasn't actually an important part of the biophilia of living in that city. So we've been trying to think about what makes for a biophilic city. What is a biophilic city? And of course, it's the presence or absence of nature, of course, and we look to fantastic examples like Helsinki. That's the background map is Helsinki. And the one notion is the idea that you ought to be able to walk out your door and have nature all around you, and then be able to move to progressively larger amounts of nature. So that in the case of Helsinki, you can walk from the center of that pretty dense city all the way out to old-growth forest at the edge. So it's that neighborhood, block, city, region even that we've got to think about, and the idea of integrated networks of nature, integrated networks of green space that are connected and hierarchical to a certain degree. So it's a terrific city to start with. In this book, we try to start developing the metrics of how you might define a biophilic city, and this is not a very nice slide, but it's actually a box from the book. Biophilic conditions and infrastructure, a pretty important category. We have a lot of examples now of cities being creative about how they measure the nature and creative in how they set targets for the future. Pretty common now, of course, for cities to incorporate some kind of target of having all their residents within a certain distance, a 5 to 10 minute walk, or a few hundred meters from a park or a green space. New York, other cities have done this. In the European Union, there is something called the Green Capital City designation. We've got one partner city that last year was the Green Capital City. In that application process, one of the things cities have to calculate is what percentage of your population lies within 300 meters of a park or green space. I'd probably argue 100 meters might be a better measure. So we're doing more of that. Many cities, of course, have calculated their vegetative cover or their tree canopy cover, and they're incorporating those kind of standards into their plans. That's important, but it's not the only thing. So that's one category. Biophilic activities. It's just as important, I would argue, to understand how urban residents actually engage that nature or don't. How interested, how active are they? Are they members of a birding club, a native plants organization? Are they active in urban greening and urban restoration, stream restoration work? How much time is spent outside? These are all important measures of engagement and in some ways care for the environment, for the nature around them. A third category, biophilic attitudes and knowledge. How much do we know about that nature around us, and what is our affect towards it? How do we care about it? And then finally, biophilic institutions and governance. We know from looking at a number of our partner cities that the extent of the nature and the extent of the engagement with the nature by residents in those cities depends on a number of things. It depends on investments, on governance, on having foundational institutions. Things like a natural history museum are often important. One of our partner cities, Milwaukee, has just opened their third neighborhood-based urban ecology center. Those kinds of things are quite important to activating that biophilic engagement, if you will. So this was a kind of preliminary set of indices or set of metrics, and so this Biophilic Cities project we're working on now, funded by the Summit Foundation, Washington-based foundation, I should have said, will be fleshing out and articulating these metrics in a little bit more detail. Just another slide to make the point that it is not just the calculation of nature, not just the presence or absence of nature in that city, it's all of these other ways that we engage in nature. And a lot of it has to do with culture as well. The question about awe and wonder and being curious about the nature around us. And a culture of curiosity is something I often talk about. We see it in cities. It may be hard to measure it, But that's something as important to cultivate as the actual nature, I would say. So we have been talking, we sometimes use the language of vitamin G or vitamin N, as Rich Louv has talked about it. We've got our slightly different language. One of the key questions for us on this project, though, is what do we need? What is it that urbanites, how much and what kind of nature is needed in urban settings? And we sometimes frame this as what is the minimum daily requirement of nature? We've found it very helpful to think about this in terms of what we call the nature pyramid. You all know about the food pyramid as it's a little irritating that the USDA now is using plates rather than the food pyramid, but we like that. You know, the idea of having some guidance about what you should eat based on this pyramid, the things at the top may be good for you in small measures and small amounts, but that we want to build your diet at that base. So it's fruits and vegetables and grains and things like that. Well, what are the analogous things in a nature diet, in our nature pyramid? There are things at that top. Flying off to Costa Rica to immerse yourself in the cloud forest for a month may not be the way we want you to do it. Maybe it's not going to be possible for most people, and our global carbon footprint we can't afford to have you do that. So we've got to think about what is that, again, the everyday nature. What are the building blocks of the nature experience? And that's something we're trying to parse and flesh out a little bit. So even thinking about what constitutes a dose, or what constitutes a serving, if you want to carry forward this nutritional comparison. Is a dose, or is a serving a bird flying by, enjoying that bird's sound? Is it two birds? Two birds and a green roof? Two birds, a green roof, and 5 trees? It gets complicated. And in urban environments, we have a combination of things at work. We want to know something about what they deliver in terms of value and benefit and wonder, for instance. So that's a key question. I don't have any answers for you at the moment, but we're trying to address that. It's interesting, some of our partner cities like this idea of the nature pyramid, so they've started to develop their own. I sometimes get this question, well, is the nature pyramid, is this kind of like this, every city have their own version of this, and is it like the Mediterranean diet? And you can't. And so our partner city, Singapore, decided they wanted their own pyramid based on their own their indigenous butterfly species and others. So they constructed their own version of this, which is sort of interesting that every city might have their own nature pyramid. So we have a lot of challenges, and we have become profoundly disconnected from the nature, the natural environment. I do this. I've been doing this visual survey for many years where I show audiences, and I've shown a lot of students, native species of flora and fauna, common species of birds and trees and plants, and the recognition level is very low. It often is a very discouraging thing to do. I've kind of stopped doing it now, partly because it is so discouraging. So this critter on the top, it's a silver-spotted skipper. It's actually, you must have it here, a very common species of butterfly. And over the course of hundreds of people, I've had maybe 2 correctly identify it. And mostly it is recognized as a moth, which it could be. But a lot of people declare it to be a monarch butterfly. It doesn't look anything like a monarch butterfly. Apparently Americans, the only butterfly we know is a monarch butterfly. And I've had at least two or three respondents tell me that it was a hummingbird, which I thought was kind of creative. So we don't have any trouble with corporate logos, though. So as one little indicator, and I'm not usually asking, I don't actually care that much if people can't tell me the name, but as long as they recognize it. And that's, so we have become disconnected. And for me lately, biophilia is very much, it's not just the things that you see, it's the sound, it's multisensory. And sound for me is a very special part of this. In my part of the world, this time of year, summer coming, and where the nighttime, the evening sounds are just therapeutic. And they're place embedding, and they're They take me back to my childhood, in fact. And they, sounds are really important. And we are just as incapable, by the way, of recognizing and identifying the sounds that we hear. I don't have time today, but I often give a little sound element to this quiz. And there's a beautiful sound that I hear almost every evening, which is an eastern screech owl, and it's this beautiful, has this kind of part of the sound is a downward whinny, kind of. Okay, it sounds like a sick owl, but you get the idea. It's a beautiful sound, and once you hear it, you never forget it. But most people don't know what it is, so it becomes a kind of background noise. In contrast to thinking about those sounds in the city as voices. This is a beautiful quote. Val Plumwood was an environmental ethicist from Australia. She's since passed away, but she talked a lot about hearing sound as voice. So we have been trying to develop sound maps for Charlottesville, and we're about to launch one for Portland, Oregon, which is one of our partner cities. And we've got to think more about the multisensorial dimensions of this, and especially sound. So, by the way, 2 summers ago, I spent a bit of time in Australia recording urban sounds there, and this was one of my favorites, the Australian raven, which has this sound almost like a baby crying, very distinctive, and they talk to each other. It's just a beautiful place embedded in sound. Okay, so the remaining slides really are just a few stories about what our partner cities are doing, some of the things that they're doing, some of the ways they're imagining their cities as being more connected to nature and more full of nature. So this is Luisa Rive, who is the environment director for the city of Vitoria-Gasteiz, the capital of the Basque Country in Spain. And they were last year's European Green Capital city. And they've been well known in Europe for this remarkable green ring that circles this city. It's a terrific effort promoting a compact, mixed-use, very walkable, dense Spanish city, but then having this amazing natural feature surrounding the city. Most neighborhoods are never more than a short walk away from the green ring, and includes actually a conversion of their former municipal airport, back into a wetland, which has become a rather important migratory bird stopover. But the latest story in Vitoria is that they have elected a new mayor, and the mayor campaigned on bringing the green ring into the city. So they're now talking about an interior green ring, which seems sort of counterintuitive, the language of that, but it's interesting. So this is an initial mapping of possibilities, and they're starting with one corridor where they're going to be bringing back to the surface a stream that has been underground in a pipe. So this idea of stream daylighting that actually several of our partner cities are working on. So a terrific story there. Oslo is another of our study cities. Remarkable effort here to connect to nature. 2/3 of the city of Oslo is in protected forest. We call it Marka, they have a word for it. And a public transit system where transit stations have been located to get people to the forest. And they're densifying that remaining third of the city. So they're becoming more compact and denser and more sustainable at the same time that they're protecting and enhancing that nature. The latest part of the Oslo effort has been a municipal green plan, which envisions daylighting, bringing back to the surface and restoring the 8 major rivers that run through the city, so connecting the forest with the fjord. The lower map actually is of their amazing urban trail network, which is another part of the Oslo story. So you're never very far away from a trail. This is an image on the left of one segment of the trail, just a few hundred meters away from offices and dense urban environment. So the ability to get out and get on a bicycle and to have access walking and bicycling to these larger green networks is really quite an important aspect of a biophilic city. San Francisco is another of our partner cities, and they partly what they are working on is how do you take smaller leftover spaces in the city and incorporate nature and growing of plants and growing of food increasingly. So they have a project run by the Public Works Department in San Francisco to allow neighborhoods to take over the median strips in certain places. They have a couple hundred of these. And this is one which is right on the beach, and a case of a little 500 feet long, 16 or 17 feet wide sort of space. It's now become a community gathering spot and grows some food and has some nature in a pretty dense urban environment. The latest story, San Francisco has done so many things to make it easier to convert hard space to nature. They've had a fantastic effort at creating a new permitting system for sidewalk gardens that actually allows neighborhoods to take up some of the, oh my gosh, okay, I've got to go faster, 5 minutes left. So the most recent story is their parklets program. So they've created a mechanism for converting on-street parking spaces. So a parklet, this concept of a parklet, 2 to 3 on-street parking spaces converted to a park. And this is an image actually of the first residential parklet. This is Jane Martin on the right, who's a landscape architect and who designed this little space, but delivers quite a bit of nature, including a vegetative dinosaur, which connects to the deeper history in that city. Portland, I mentioned, as another partner city. They have 1,000 green features in this city that collect stormwater, this idea of green streets and multifunctional spaces in the city, providing nature but also collecting and treating stormwater. This is Linda Dobson, who heads the stormwater program in Portland. She's our partner, and she's standing in the courtyard of an apartment complex called 10th and Hoyt, where all the water collected on that, all the water that falls on that site is collected and kept there and circulated around through a series of interesting water features and water art. And the residents actually come out when it rains to listen to the rain. What a marvelous story. I mentioned Milwaukee. These are images of the third neighborhood-based ecology center, which is quite spectacular. And they're actually taking a portion of the Menominee River and restoring it. The whole story of rivers and the importance of rivers in the ecology and the nature cities is a key one. My last few slides, and then I'll stop, have to do with Singapore. Singapore, I mentioned, is a partner city. And the story here is interesting. We have a special interest in Singapore as we imagine more cities growing in a very vertical way. How do you have a vertical city? Most residents of Singapore are living in high-rise buildings. How do you maintain or foster that connection with nature, with the natural world, in that very vertical realm? And this is an area where Singapore has really been innovative. So this image on the right, they've added about 2 million people in the last 15 years at the same time that the percentage of green cover has increased, not decreased, but increased. So they've invested in parks. They have a fantastic, what they call a system of park connectors. So creating trails and walking structures that get people from those densest parts of the city to the existing parks. Much of it looks like this, which is an elevated canopy level walk system. They've been subsidizing, helping to support the creation of new gardens, new school greening initiatives. We've actually just done a film about Singapore. So if you're interested, the whole film is on YouTube. It's about 45 minutes. If you just Google Singapore, a biophilic city, you'll find it. So we tell stories. We film in a number of places. This is a fantastic, amazing green school and a fernery in the background of these students. And Bishan Park, where they've basically taken a channelized river and turned it back into a beautiful, meandering natural system. Probably most impressively, though, the city has been promoting this idea of vertical greening. The National Parks Board has actually created a skyrise greening division within government to promote this. So there are subsidies. There's a research and development aspect to this. They're testing different vertical systems, and trying to understand what works. They have standards now that require that when you build a new building, you have to compensate for the green taken away. You actually have to provide more green in the vertical calculation than you've taken over in terms of surface area. So this is one example on the left. Solaris is a new Kenyang building where it's designed as there's a 1.5 kilometer forest that wraps around the structure. It's a different kind of nature, obviously more artificial, but it does deliver benefits, and in a very vertical urban environment, that's quite important. A more local example is Villa Verde in New York, and we did some interviewing there, and there's a little case study about this Bronx project, Jonathan Rowe's project. It was just terrific, where there's a forest on the 3rd level, a orchard on the 4th, raised bed gardens on the 5th, and then as you progressively go up, kind of tiered roof system, really quite creative, and leading to a very high-rise building. So green in a very dense sort of urban environment. Okay, I've run out of time. There are other programs that I could tell you about. Maybe I'll stop here. We've become as interested, again, there's the physical design of cities and the green elements, but there are also the programming elements. And how do we get urbanites imagining themselves interested in all of these things around them? So we've just, the e-newsletter coming out this week will profile a really interesting project based in North Carolina and Florida called the School of Ants. I want you to enroll in the School of Ants. This is a citizen science project that involves kids sending ant samples from around the country, and they've developed a fantastic urban ant key, a kind of guide to how you identify the different species of ants that you're likely to find. And these folks have actually, the ones that did the ants studies of the median scripts in New York, and actually discovered an entirely new species of ant that hadn't been known about. So I'll stop there, and I probably have more slides, but maybe I'll have a chance to insert more as we go along.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
How appropriate you ended with this ant, because E.O. Wilson is an entomologist.
That's right.
Growing up in South Carolina, and really his whole research emphasis and contribution to science was through his work on ants and ants chemistry. Right?
And ants invoke awe and wonder, and we know enough about them.
I see some people already fleeing for the biological break that he did
long
not
morning.
put in to the morning, but down this end of the hall to the center and downstairs and down these sets of stairs you will find bathrooms. But I'll let people do that as they wish and come back in and join us. But let's have the speakers come forward, and I'm sure this is going to raise a lot of interest in this group of audience, and so just put the three of you at the table. You know, one never knows how these sessions will come together, and I think this was beautifully designed and planned to look at nature, to look at architecture, to look at cities, and this doesn't happen, I guess, by circumstance. It happens because someone is thinking deeply about the message, the organization, the interaction of the three of you, and that is Julia Africa. And Julia Africa is a research associate working with us. That is, she stepped out, there she is, up there. She's the connective tissue that binds us, the faculty, and really makes this happen. So Julia, thank you so much for this and everything. Julia reminds me that at lunch she has organized to have a street vendor, a van, available outside here. I guess a quarter over 12 or so, 11:45. And then you can come back in, use the dining hall, the room down at the end of this hallway to chat with others with your lunch. If you wanted to take a little walk, the weather is better through our natural settings in our campuses, or artificial plantings, I guess. You can find a Broadway market just 2 blocks down the street right in front of this building. down there. And if people wanted more diversity, I can direct them to Mass Ave if they want. So that's in case the line's along here and you want to have something else. On the menu, the cuisine is what?
South Indian Sri Lankan food, and you'll note that at the registration table there's also a full listing of all of the neighborhood
Good.
eateries in the directions. Of course, anyone who's local.
Good. Thank you so much. So I could prime this discussion. I have so many questions and comments to ask of this group, but you've been taking this all in. So let's get the microphone passed here first. The first hand up here, then back of the room. All right, we got 3 on the queue, then 4 on the list. Good. Wow. 5 and 6. Okay, you might have to raise again, but please, here. Just say who you are, just to tell us. That is that mic. That is not a mic. Is that a mic for the room?
We're adjusting the sound.
Adjusting the sound. Okay.
Are we on? Am I on now?
Yeah.
You are.
You are.
Well, you actually all spoke about the eye-brain connection, and I had 2 short questions. Do you think that the urban scene without green space is more depressing because the eye is busier and it therefore has a certain effect on the brain? And I did wonder about the other senses, whether, particularly in the forests, do you think that not being able to see can affect the brain, or is the hearing and perhaps the taste and other things, are they just as important? Thanks.
Sure, I'll just get that started for you. You bring up a great point or question regarding the busyness, if you will, of even a scene of an urban environment. And that's the heart and soul of the cognitive restoration theory, is that in an urban environment, the brain is working overtime to filter out so many things, right? And it takes a tremendous amount of effort to stay on point at the task at hand. Imagine yourself walking down a crowded mall at the holidays, right? Everything's coming at you. It takes a tremendous amount of brain energy to stay on point there. Or negotiating websites where there's pop-up bars and really cool stories that may or may not be relevant on the left and the right-hand side. All of that requires placing the brakes on the brain. And there's an entire system in the brain called the GABA system. And it takes a lot of fuel to run it. But it's basically you're pressing the brakes on so that you can stay focused on the task at hand. That doesn't really happen. At least the evidence suggests that it doesn't happen when someone's in a natural setting or even viewing a highly fascinating nature scene. You're not running the GABA system because you're inherently fascinated by it and it's not using fuel to nearly the same degree. Now, with regard to the other elements in a forest setting, for example, the Japanese researchers have also looked at something called phytoncides. Phytoncides are similar to aromatherapy, but you often can't smell them. And they are able to collect them about 4 feet off the ground. And in particular, green leafy trees emit them into the air. Pine trees, evergreens in particular, emit a lot. Cedar tree, for example. And they are correlating these phytoncides with animal behavior. The animals are actually a bit nicer when they're breathing in the phytoncides, right? They're more sociable, right? And so there's so many things at play. I mean, and briefly, and I'll pass it over to my colleagues here, but one other quick note. The mere bacterium on the soil, someone's gardening, they're making incidental contact with Mycobacterium vaccae, right? Recently, scientists found that when they gave a little tiny amounts of Mycobacterium vaccae, again, the same bacteria that you find in garden soil, they put it into the animal chow at minuscule amounts, and those animals became less anxious and more sociable. So to what extent is our microbial withdrawal from nature influencing us is a massive question as well. And I'm sorry to take up so much time on my colleagues here, but
You've heard the expression, you can smell the rain. Well, this part of the
negative ions,
experience.
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I would just add that I obviously just made the point. The sound is important to me, but it's all those things, the multisensory, just not based on the science so much as just my own experiences. But one thing, and we're not doing enough in urban design and planning to sort of take those things into account. And one of the things about sound that interests me is we know a lot about the negative impact of noise in hospital environments. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear that noise is almost the #1 thing that is associated with a stressful hospital experience. And we have decibel restrictions in cities, we have noise ordinances, but we're not paying very much attention to that. Partly, so I'm wondering about, can we imagine quiet spaces in cities? And that's to be contemplated. Don't we need to moderate those noises? I'm thinking about car noise, car traffic noise in particular, and we have some examples of Scandinavian cities that have designated quiet areas, but partly you're going to hear those nature sounds, you know, if you have quiet areas. But shouldn't that be on our planning and design agenda?
The search for God. Let's go deep here. You know, we have searched for God since we come to this earth. And the fastest way that we have found to achieve that, one is nature, but the other one has been contemplation and meditation. And those are usually internally induced states. In other words, I pray, close usually my eyes, or I sit in meditation. And there's a fundamental different experience than the one we are talking here, the three of us, which are externally induced. They're not internally induced. You know, I mean, I have a mantra, or have Hail Mary, or breath, or whatever practice you have. You disengage the world, so your sensorium collapses. And when you look at the brain in meditation, basically all those, the occipital lobes and all that, they are turned off. It's a remarkable vision that there is no activity of the sensorium. Therefore, this engagement, oneness, unity, they're easier to achieve. So God is easier access, let's put it that way. But it takes huge amount of time to achieve that level of practice. It takes years and years. Yet we have a much more natural way to attain these states, which I think partially is nature. Of course, we have been evolving with that. But my argument would be architecture can do that, and of course, sacred space have been doing this all the time. Now, when I was looking at the architecture, you saw that Merleau-Ponty would be very happy, for instance. The phenomenologists would be extraordinarily happy to know that the embodiment is fundamental to the experience. So the access to this other alternative or spiritual sense of being is one of embodiment and not disembodiment like usually happens. So in that sense, although in most of the cases that you saw, because of the difficulty of technology, certain condition of sound, smell particularly, and touch are very hard to assess because of the technology of fMRI and stuff like that. Eventually, when technology goes more evolved, I would foresee that that's going to be an essential condition. So visuality right now is what becomes more natural because of the technological limitation. But I would expect, like we are saying here, that sound is going to be fundamental and so on.
Talking about sound, I have my students download decibels and find the quiet place on campus or the noisiest place on campus, and so we get this free app. It's just a fun experience to pull in information that's all around you. So.
That's cool. Yeah, that's good.
Here, please.
Does this work?
By the way, I have 4 that I have on the list. Let me hold off on others and we'll reload, all right? And I got your number 3, your number 4, and Andrew was up earlier. I'll come back. Can't keep everyone in mind.
I'm A.T. Mann, and I've written books about the sacred, and I'm working on a documentary in coordination with the Dalai Lama's Foundation about neuroscience and meditation. And since I'm writing the script, I came across some extraordinary information recently that I found a resonance of in all 3 of your talks, which is the following. And it's quite staggering, I think, that somewhere between 60% and 85% of the neuronal connections in our brain are dedicated to processing visual material, meaning that the other functions occupy 15 to 20% maximum. And what that involves is that once one meditates by simply closing your eyes, you're actually removing that 80% of visual stimuli from the brain, and hence almost automatically creating a more meditative state. Also, I was curious vis-a-vis the sacred, that when you go to sacred places, that it's primarily a visual and sensual experience, and that it seems to cut through people's belief systems, through their cultural artifacts, through all kinds of other issues. And I'm beginning to realize more and more that that visual reality is something that we see happening. It's like, again, as you're saying, you can see trees. It makes a stronger impact than anything we're actually hearing. I'd be curious what your reaction to this kind of information is. And I appreciated all the talks.
Thank you.
Well, I don't, Alan probably knows the science better than I do, but I just, partly my defense of sound, or my desire to move it to a more prominent position is in response to how privileged the ocular, is, and maybe, as you're saying, for good reason. I tend to think of them as all working together, though. I mean, that's they do, of course they do, and so to kind of parse them out makes it, so to have the visual and the sound, and as the forest bathing sort of suggests, it's that combination of things that you're seeing something quite different if you're hearing something with it, right? So neuroplasticity,
that overlapping of those functions, and the shifting from one to the other, obviously.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Right.
But
yeah. I was just going to say, I think that is the key. The neuroplasticity is the key, because if you're shutting off one, component, one valve, then the others start to become more in tune, and that in tune can go either way. It could be I'm more in tune to the bird sounds, or that aircraft noise is really stressing me out. Do you know what I mean? So it can shift in either direction.
But you had something else.
Yeah, I just want to say something. You're saying is right. The deal is also this. There is called the default network, which I mentioned. That's how we are operating in our ordinary state, which is not necessarily conscious in the mystical tradition. It's kind of half sleep. So what you're saying is right, but that the whole visuality of the system is going in this default network, which basically produces mind wandering. You are here, but suddenly you're thinking tomorrow. So once you want nature or sacred space, suddenly that network collapses, and it's still you can have visuality occupying, but it's just focus and narrows, and that's why a lot of these places are very minimal design. They are not very complex.
Okay, back here, please, and then you.
My name is.
Wow.
I'm used to speaking loudly without a mic. I'm Reverend Penny Greer. I'm a United Church of Christ pastor and an alum from here, and this is the first time I've been back in 30 years.
All right.
Thank you. I've also become a geologist, and in my training, I have a bachelor's and I'm pursuing a master's in my later years. In my training, we've pretty much ignored the green. I'm always one, since I did major in biology in my first college experience long ago, who's curious about it. But in my training in evaluating and reading rocks and their stratigraphic significance, or soil and similar, we don't pay attention to the green. So for all three of you, the green is a literal reality, and it's also a metaphor, except for you, sir, who are talking more about, of course, architecture. But you're not looking at stones in the same way that we would be, of course. So I've been sitting here thinking all the time, I yearn for more exposure to deep time. Now maybe that's a learned awareness that is very hard for people to obtain, so that they pass an outcrop. So often our world is outcrop poor, but if it's outcrop wealthy, then we can have some experience with it. Perhaps it's a learned response, and we really can't have the same kind of changes that you have all documented with MRIs and other good measures. So I've just been sitting here playing with those thoughts as you've all been talking, and I would love to hear your responses.
Well, I guess I'll go first and just say that, learned response. And that is, I think you've really hit the nail on the head with how critical this is to teach. Because the one thing that we really didn't discuss through the morning, there's a flip side to this entire conversation, and that is this sort of tech overwhelm, the synthetic overwhelm that particularly our young children are living in. It's not an anti-technology message that I'm trying to provoke here, but it's a reality. when you follow children who are accumulating tremendous amounts of screen time, that screen time was always sort of written off. Well, only the kids that are racking that up, they're doing that because they're already depressed or anxious. But the prospective studies are rolling in now. And it actually becomes a predictor of subsequent depression and anxiety. If compared to the 80s, if you're consuming 60% more information in a given day outside of school or work, it means you're not doing 60% of something else. Now, a lot of that information is amazing for us and our families. We can learn and the tools we've talked about, but a lot of it's junk. You know, Russell Crowe, I've just picked up my dry cleaning. That's a tweet that's out. It was in the paper.
Oh, when'd you get that message?
Yeah. So you have that dialogue, right? And that's where it leads into your point about learn. And there are researchers in Canada who, in their university, among their university students, they ask them up front, to what extent do you think nature might influence your mental outlook? They have a very low predictive value. They don't think it's going to do much for them in terms of their mood, their mental outlook. Yeah. But when they trick them and take them on one of two different walks on campus, right? A 20-minute walk. Yeah. One through the buildings and tunnels at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa. It's quite cold, so there's loads of connecting tunnels. And the other one in a rich vegetation area walk. The nature walk did improve their mental outlook. And once they became aware of it, that recognition was there, they subsequently became more nature connected, if you will, and had more pro-environmental attitudes. Yeah. So the notion is that we do, actually it's one of our primary missions, is to actually teach this. It needs to be learned, particularly from a young age if possible, right? And longing for the green, I mean, I could go on about that all day. I actually suspect that seasonal affective disorder, there's no question it's mediated by light, vitamin D to a degree, but I do believe...
I think I'm the luckiest kid in the world, because going to both junior high and high school, every single day, cut through my backyard and through this little funky little park in Arlington, Massachusetts, every single day. My scores didn't show it, but other than that, I was refreshed.
Yeah, and that's got to be part of what we're doing is making it easier to have that kind of experience and designing it in a way that the kids can do what you did. So I've just come back from Montreal where they have this amazing green alleys program. So they're basically letting neighborhoods sort of take these leftover back spaces that kids walk through and are spending time and then green them and grow things and have gardens and so on. But we've been grappling in my team with this question about how we feel about technology. It's interesting, and there are a lot of apps and augmented reality. If you could wave your phone and learn the deep time
story of that geologic formation that you're walking by, it's possible that we've got iBird and iTree and all. It's not all bad, but you're right. The prognosis isn't looking too good.
Right, let's go here. We're going to alternate sides of the room. I got Andrew next, and then we'll come back and back. I got hands up, and my microphone people will help me. So Andrew, you're next over here. Doug, can you give it to Andrew? Gray sweater, light tan sweater there. Yeah. And then we'll get you, and then please.
Thank you very much for 3 wonderful presentations. Walter Harper, anthropologist. I'd like to ask any one of you, in terms of research, any connections in terms of school bullying or academic achievement on what you presented thus far this morning in your presentations?
Well, I can definitely do the latter first. The academic achievement has certainly been done. You may have just missed that one slide, perhaps, before you came in, on Michigan school system, where they looked at over 100, it was actually 101 Michigan public schools. They controlled for socioeconomic status, the age of the building, a whole host of variables, and they found that the view to green, rich vegetation, not a mowed lawn, predicted achievement on state-run examinations. It also predicted one's statement that I plan to pursue, university-based education and so on. There have been other studies of the same ilk. Not, to me, that's the best one, but there's other studies that have, particularly in elementary schools and so on, that nature-based learning does make a difference academically. Yeah, I'm not aware of one directly.
No, the Michigan study of high schools did show less detention time and less juvenile delinquency issues.
Yeah,
so it's an interesting study.
Yeah, there have been other studies like that where aggressive behavior has been minimized. And actually, there was one in, I believe it was Chicago, and they looked at tree canopy cover, and that was associated with less aggressive behavior in certain, among young kids. I believe they were between 6 and 10 years old. So there's some research out there.
But by the way, we have the Green Index for every public school in Massachusetts. So if you could find the bullying records, we can.
Interesting.
Yeah. I would also say that there's evidence about outdoor learning as being very helpful too in that. So views of nature are great. We want them in schools, but we also want to get kids outside. And so that's often, we are finding lots of places where schools are perched on the edge of a nature preserve or a park or something, and there's no relationship, between the teaching mission and that nature. And we've got to work on that.
Andrew up here, and then we'll come back over. Andrew.
Thank you so much. I should apologize in advance for this question because there are so many competing ideas screaming at me in my head. But this idea of awe, I think, I did a study where I looked at 3 different communities and asked them about sacredness, and they were all communities that were built with the intention of being in harmony with nature. And I asked them about sacredness, and I let them run with that word in whatever way they wanted to. And one of the better questions I asked was, what are sacred feelings? And even though they had different descriptions of what sacredness was to them or meant to them, awe was probably the most common word that they used. But the reason why I think it's important is because awe can be really awful. And it's difficult. I think awe is difficult.
That's awe shucks.
And it's because when you encounter something that's so much bigger than you, it challenges, your ego, like maybe Dennis's comment before. I want to bring it up because I think there's a resistance that we all have to slowing down, and a resistance that we all have to engaging the awe. And I think that's something that designers are going to be tasked with. Is how do we? You mentioned tricking people into taking a walk. How do we? Have you heard the word fasciculate?
First of all, can you tell me what that word means? Let's have the panel respond. I think you put it to them nicely.
Let me start with this. The survey I show, which showed 2 minutes, I have a lot of publications, so if you're interested, I can show to you. But that was really the core of the matter. I mean, you find the divine in awe. You don't find it otherwise. Rudolf Otto have a lot of book on this, on the numinous, and of course, Burke and the sublime is when you find the awe not prepared, So you could find the terrible or the horrific sublime, which is awful, or awe, really this moving, blissful experience, and it's really it's one recoils the loss of selfhood. That's when you have the horrific experience. You are at the edge of death. The ego of self feels like that. In Zen, they're saying that dying in the cushion, but also the sense of mystic unit in the Christian tradition. The idea of losing yourself with God. Now, if you are ready, however you want to say what that is, you will have a blissful experience of communion, really with capital, which is what you saw in the neuroscience project I show. The deepest experience is one of oneness, which could be fullness in the Christian tradition, of emptiness in the Eastern tradition. But both, I believe, in the end are talking the same thing. Now, when you go to awfulness, is when you're not ready and you just recoil in horror because you feel like you're just going to die. And now how we do it? In architecture, we have millennia. I mean, you go to the Pantheon, you do it like that. I mean, you could get surprise. Surprise is a very important aspect of getting this. But you could also, through a gradual process, you go to charts, and you gradually enter that in the process of slowness. It's a slow process. But there are techniques that we have developed through millennia, and we need to remember them and deploy them. Not just architectural, but my argument will be that now, can we have some of these studies in the urban environment? Can we deploy them in the urban environment? I believe it's possible. And it may have to do with other traditions, not this crazy, I mean, going back to what Philip was talking, perhaps we need to look at new ways of thinking that are not so new, but they're looking back to the old ways.
Moderator's prerogative. I'm going to have my colleague ask a question here, then Doug, right, those two next, and then we'll come to you. All right.
Thanks again for coming. I'm so delighted to have a panel like that, and the presentations were wonderful. This is a question primarily for Alan, just to push back on something you said earlier about fight insides. A question for you. My understanding.
Could you speak out?
Sure. This question primarily for Alan to sort of probe something you said earlier about fight insides. And my understanding is from the botanists and ecologists here at the university that many fight insides, it's a broad class of volatile compounds, but many fight insides are defensive compounds.
Sure.
That is, when a tree branch is broken or when a leaf is bitten by an insect, it may release that compound in part as a signaling mechanism to other trees and other plants in the forest to say, okay, there's a problem here. So I wonder if you can comment, just given the extraordinary emphasis that the researchers, particularly in Japan and Korea and Taiwan, are placing on the effect of these phytoncides having a palliative effect on human physiology. Have any of them been able to comment on why it would be sort of an alarm compound from plants and yet have this effect on human physiology? That is, for an insect, it would signal a free meal, but for a human being, you might expect it could say, the herd of elephants is coming through the forest, trampling things, run. You know. So do they have a sense as to why it has this differential effect in the different physiologies?
It's a great question, Julie, and I think I thought about it before, believe it or not. I don't have all the answers, but I have a theory, and that is that they're structurally similar to antioxidants, right? The same mechanisms that play all these wonderful antioxidants that we know from red wine and all those purple pigments and so on from apples, cherries, blueberries, that's the same thing. There's a higher concentration of those phytochemicals, antioxidants, in a defensive pushback against threat by a plant, right? So the more a plant has to defend itself, the greater the antioxidant levels. There is emerging research indicating that antioxidants leave just a tiny little bit, and just keep this very simplistic here, a little tiny bit of extra serotonin around, if you will, because they're preventing the breakdown at the synapse in minuscule amounts. But nevertheless, that's one of the mechanisms that they may be helping. So to me, it's a similar situation that you have in antioxidants, because although the antioxidant story is overblown, that's for sure commercially in terms of how it's co-opted, but there's no question that a diet rich in colorful fruits and vegetables that are rich in antioxidants is protective against human health. So the why it is that these chemicals that are defensive in plants work to our advantage may come down to antioxidant, anti-inflammatory activity.
Interesting. And the oral sensing mechanism is a direct pathway to the brain, except all the other sensors are mediated.
That's right.
So maybe there's something to it. Up there and then down.
Yes. My name is Nini. All the different ways of increasing well-being of the others, and what we've had so far seems to put emphasis at the bottom on visuality. And what we had about 60% or more of your brain is focused on that. And so, but the question is, we are playing into modernity, because before writing, in the oral society, the eye was not the most important sense of the human being. The five senses play. So like in the place I grew up, to understand is to hear, if you translate it. But in the Western society today, to understand is to see. Did you see the point? And so it has different, yes, so it has how the different senses do play. And studies have shown that now that the Western society is coming with video and other things, the other senses are rising up again. So how will all that play in a situation where there is more balance within of the five senses rather than on the eye? Because all what we've learned so far, the bulk of it is how we see things and how it impacts us. But now that the five senses are coming to play, how will they affect the well-being of the city?
Good point.
Let me say a couple of things about that. Okay, one thing is that the fMRI experiment is an artificial thing. So you show images and things happen. Okay, so one of the interesting things we found is that the motor areas of the brain lit up. The visuals did, but the motors did, and yet they were not moving. And they had to do with a lot of research on the mirror neurons, that you see something and you act as if. So the physicality is essential to the architecture experience, which goes to the aspect, the kinesthetic aspect of being. That's one answer to your question. But I think right now the problem that we're having, as I said before, is that our technology is not capable of measuring some of these things. And I believe it's a matter of time that we'll be able to address some of your concern, which I think we most agree with. I mean, it's yes.
All right. I think a question here. I have your hand. Let's see. You're next when we come back to that side. Then you.
Actually, these are two related questions. The first question is, we talked about this large impact of the visual, and I've always assumed as an architect, and when I look at images, I'm actually hearing the cathedral when I see the visual. So I was wondering if there's any evidence for these being, as you said, combined, and especially Julio, if you found in your study that since senses were cued just through the visual, you also had a response in maybe the auditory area or the other tactile areas or whatever. And then the other question is a kind of different one, looking at, for us, the urban environment is full of information, but the natural environment is not very full of information, as you pointed out. And I was wondering if, for other cultures, perhaps the natural environment is so full of information that you can't relax in it because you see all these different signs. So those were two questions.
Okay. Do you want the third? You want to start with the second, maybe? I mean, that's an interesting question. We know that in Native American cultures there's a greater awareness of what things are and a deeper. I mentioned Australia. We know Aboriginals culture has a lot of names for a lot of things. You can't walk across a stream at a particular point without having that point named or having it have some important meaning. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of overload, or is that just kind of distracting? I think quite the contrary. It's more about a deeper sense of place, a deeper connection to place, a feeling of oneness with one's environment, which is actually relaxing rather and stress reducing rather than. So it's a good question. How do we shift a little bit in our modern American culture, especially, and deepen the richness of the information we have about the nature? We do have, again, all these apps that I'm not sure that I want my iPhone to be the answer, but it may be oral history, it may be our grandparents conveying information about how that's the significance of the cardinal in their lives when growing, whatever it is. Finding ways to deepen, enrich the information that we have about nature and making it part of our everyday lives.
Cross-cultural research to see
what works or what.
Really, if there is something, maybe the natural environment isn't necessarily suited.
Well, there is. Well, you're bringing up. Can I just ask before I pass it to Julio? I will address that really quickly. There is some cross-cultural research, and the appeal is universal to certain elements. Some trees, but not too many. A vista where you can actually see water, the presence of water, and green. Those are your combinations that's universally acceptable as being pleasurable. That's the view I like best. And with regard to the other point about we do need to figure out, well, what might be threatening, it's a very important point. There was a study just published that looked at how people might find urban green space therapeutic, but also frightening. And if there's too many spots where an individual could hide, for example, they actually found that to be anxiety-provoking, right? So they wanted to see, and they didn't want too many trees densely packed either. So they're starting to do work on this now about what is the sweet spot for a therapeutic experience in an urban green space.
I would just add one thing about when we did the contrast between, let's say, the full brain contrast between control and experiment. We found the experiment, meaning the contemplative spaces, there was a lot more activation of the parietal lobes, which actually are the part of the brain that integrates all the senses. Although, so it was more visual, the integration was happening. So I would say with sound it would be the same, but we didn't do the sound part.
Okay, so we are back over here. Yes.
I'm Rick Wetzler. I'm an ecologist, ecological scientist by training, and an architectural wannabe. So I'm speaking to your question, and also points that the panel has raised. I train my students in terms of reading a landscape, in terms of the information you can gather in the continuum from, let's say, an agricultural uniform or homogeneous array of resources. You may be predisposed to certain pest outbreaks, the greater the concentration of that resource or homogeneity, to, let's say, a rainforest, a tropical rainforest at the opposite end of the spectrum, where each new glance harvests so much more information, more species are very quickly encountered. As an architectural wannabe, an architect wannabe, I look at buildings and I see, all right, I've got the repertoire in a quarter of a second as to what this building is conveying. On the other hand, I can look at marvelous architecture, in my perspective anyway, and I'm constantly harvesting new bits of information as my eye rolls across the facade and the fenestration. Even sitting in this room, without even having to look at the nature behind, I'm transfixed by the lyric seeming images and the carving of the wooden beams and so forth. I'm wondering how this translates in the gathering of information in the parietal lobes where it's integrated, or you were talking, Alan, about the GABA system. What happens is I look at that first slide, Julio, you showed, perhaps it was from Sao Paulo, mile after mile of high-rise, identical structures that it's got to breed a kind of soporific state in the brain compared to some of the more beautifully integrated and yet diverse, visually diverse, be more equivalent to a rainforest. Is there some metric, is my first question, and is there in fact a kind of almost a visual induced illness that you can perceive when you're in the cinder block homogeneous building for too long, or the equivalent of a wheat field that is the same cultivar for miles?
I think you have the sense of that.
Oh yeah. I think it's better suited to Julio, but I'll just say very briefly, I actually think you can get a visually induced sickness by seeing those scenes. I actually found my own amygdala getting fired up when Julio had some of those scenes on there that you're referring to. And on the flip side, I mean, I'm a very anxious person. For me to come in here and talk, it provokes a lot of anxiety in me. I feel like I'm going in marching in front of a firing squad. This room in here is so incredibly therapeutic for me. I don't know why. It's just, it really is. So I totally get everything that you're saying. And now as we get a greater degree of sophistication with where Julio's heading with his research team, and then you map in the studies that I was discussing about, it's more rudimentary, but you're seeing that nature scenes are firing up completely different areas of the brain compared to the urban built environment. Now where Julio's going to go, he's going to show how a more sophisticated urban built environment can, it's not all, they're not all painted with the same brush, basically.
Alan, I thought it was about us, not the room.
Well, it's everyone. It's a very relaxing atmosphere. You guys are amazing. The questions, I'm loving it myself. But anyway, Julio, this is.
I didn't show one. Again, they showed just 12. There are a lot more, but one that didn't show, which is still working, is a limbic circuitry, and definitely the control group, which is control group basically are. Ordinary buildings, mostly institutional buildings, like school or a courthouse, an office. I think there is a group home, places that are not necessarily bad design, because I didn't want to be too biased, but ordinary buildings that are definitely not designed for contemplation. So when I say they, I speak about an ordinary American building. And basically, when you look at the limbic circuitry, you see that it is the reward mechanism are totally turned off, for instance, compared to the experiment. You're getting reward, which is partially the pleasure of things. The other thing is what I was talking about, the connection of the the beauty of these buildings and the non-judgmental part of it. I mean, when you're saying, well, I'm going to look at this and look at this and look at this, you enter in, it's called judgment. And one aspect of nature, when you go into nature walks, you're not judging, is it good, is it bad? Modernity has this tremendous problem, is that I'm in architecture school, I'm as senior as any other professor, is that we teach them to analyze to death everything. And if you cannot rationalize or explain something, you have no arguments. So when you approach sacred space, usually judgment is shut down because you are accepting the power elsewhere. So you're not entering, let's say, a church or a mosque with an attitude, I'm going to critique, usually. So you're entering with a receptive attitude. It's a total different sense of what's happening. So that's partially, I think, the results we are getting. I'm not sure if I'm responding fully to your question.
Listen, given that I think we have about 4 or 5 on this side, 4 or 5 on this side, so we're going to enter. I have all you guys in my mind. We're going to do the speed dating routine here. Quick question, little elaboration, response, and then you'll have them available to you at lunch too.
Okay.
We'll come back here.
All right, I'll try. I'm Philip Bess. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Notre Dame. I'm a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School and also a graduate of the University of Virginia.
Wow.
I'm also a Roman Catholic Christian and happily engaged with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And I say that just to preface my remarks because I want to say that that's a tradition that respects science and it respects nature. And so the question I'm going to ask is actually a question that comes from a philosophical point of view and a Nietzschean point of view. I want to kind of adopt a hermeneutic of suspicion here, because it seems to me that the way that nature has been discussed in this presentation is that there's a discussion of nature as if human beings are not part of nature. And in fact, the way that we've been talking about nature, the kinds of things that we find in the modern world, that nature as we're speaking of is actually a kind of artifact. Right? So that certainly Frederick Law Olmsted's work, I think in a very serious way has to be understood as a kind of artifact. And so the Nietzschean hermeneutic of suspicion would say that as opposed to finding the sacred in nature, right, which Nietzsche would deny is possible because he didn't think there was any such thing as the sacred. But the idea of sacralizing nature, if we're inclined to do that, that would be a tendency that Nietzsche would recognize as a mask for our own will to power. And so I want to contrast that point of view with the point of view of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which includes and goes back in part to Aristotle's understanding of human beings as intermediate beings. And we're intermediate beings in the sense that we are part of nature, and yet our powers, to some extent, transcend nature. And so, for Aristotle, making cities, right, is what the human animal does to occupy nature, and reason is how human beings participate, as animals participate in nature. And so it's just
to the point.
Yeah. Well, my point is my point is just an observation that modernity, right? That in contrast to both Nietzsche and Aristotle, who understood human beings as being part of nature, modernity presumes that human beings are outside of nature. And I'm a little concerned that the way you've been talking about it today is that we're perpetuating that error of modernity.
Well, it's a great question, and I think we have to be on guard. My notion of a city is one that nature is all around us, and we are part of that natural system. We're affecting it, we're influencing it, we're also influenced by it. So, but I think you're right. I think it's easy to lapse into that. What is nature is really a really interesting question I get all the time. And I show slides of Patrick Blanc green walls. Is that nature? Well, it's a human-created, very artificial kind of nature. that looking down at the ants, the profound natural, system there, and being in touch with the wildness of that experience in that place, that ecology. How do we tap into that and not allow ourselves to think of ourselves as being separate from nature? It's a great challenge question.
Can we, now my admonition of be brief, please, your question, then back here.
My name is Phil Tabb, professor of architecture at Texas A&M University. I have a couple images. One is Roger Ulrich painting on a wall, and this is part of the question: what if there was a picture of Rembrandt or a picture of a market in Venice or in Rome, and how would that affect stay in the hospital? And then the question really comes around to not diminishing the greening ideas that you all are coming up with, but to increase the other. So you've got the green and you've got the other. And we've all sort of talked about how negative the other is. So in the context of growing world population, how do we do both, in a sense, create more green networks and so on, yet how do we begin to change the urban environment such that it's more positive?
Well, I can definitely address in the hospital setting, there has been some research on artwork, and nature-based artwork has been shown to be therapeutic. What has consistently not been shown to be therapeutic in the data that I looked through was abstract art. And in fact, in those with mental health disorders, they were the ones that found it to be most disturbing, abstract art, which is an interesting finding, and it's more than one group of investigators has found that. So,
contemporary architecture might not be seen so well.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. You never know. We're designing and so on. No, it's true. And then in terms of the green, I'll pass it over to my colleagues, but very briefly, the notion is that a time spent in nature encourages more pro-environmental attitudes, and that is essentially a very important, simple sentence about this entire gathering today, because the two conversations are the same. Time spent in nature, opportunity to spend time in nature, equals protection of the planet.
The ultimate is for both are equally positive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We, by the way, have a new cancer center where there is an effort to actually put up paintings and art that is therapeutic and some of it nature-based. But so I'm not sure I understand what you mean by other, though. What you're contrasting nature,
the built environment,
everything else, the built environment.
Yeah, dams and roads and trains and houses.
Yeah, and to me, there's a sort of fusing, a kind of, I'm looking for ways of incorporating nature into all of those things, whether it's, we know that birds and bees and ants, and the fact that the ants are on the median strips and Broadway and New York, there's a possibility for nature that there isn't this dichotomy necessarily in our minds. I think we've got to overcome that.
We know about the Parkway. In fact, Richard Foreman's written a book recently, The Ecological Roadway, or Ecological Highway, about making that part of the experience. We know the differences in roads that we take, pathways we take.
Hi, my name is Upendra Saputa. I'm an architect and urban planner. As a planner and architect, we always struggle between the two poles of utopia and dystopia. Between those two poles, there are different layers. When we talk about different layers, it's always not possible to attain the ideal environment in real life, given the economic constraint, spatial requirement, cultural constraint. And when we talk about urban environment versus forest walk or nature walk kind of thing, the intensity and level of urban environment are also different. For example, Times Square is also urban environment, and the Quincy Market is also urban environment. And when we talk about the forest or road environment, the topography, nature elements are also diverse. So I was wondering if Julio or Alan has done any research on that particular part, because it's worth investigating, I think. Is there any information that you want to share with us in that regard?
I can tell you that there's some new research on the degrees of vegetation, right, within these settings. And again, there's that sweet spot that seems to be emerging with just the right amount of trees and green.
Yeah.
And another important point, which we never touched on this morning, which I think is important, is that the greater the vegetation variety in there. So you don't need tons and tons. Again, you don't need to have, Yosemite National Park or anything like that. Variety of vegetation equals biodiversity, equals the potential for greater mental health benefits. There have been 2 studies that have shown that now, where that biodiversity equaled greater self-reported ability to reflect, believe it or not, that quiet time. And again, on a final note, because I just think this is really fascinating, recent study looked at the biodiversity of the bacteria on the skin. They then looked at the biodiversity of the urban environment in which that person lived. And they found that the greater the biodiversity of bacteria on the skin, the greater the biodiversity of the neighborhood equals lower risk of inflammatory skin conditions. So what we're discussing here is part of a massive whole. And I think that also becomes part of the discussion there about we are part of this. We're all part of this nature, whether it's a microbe or us humans who have the potential to pillage and plunder the earth is a factor as well.
Yeah. I think we love cities. We are urban dwellers. We have prospered as a civilization because we come together in community and be together. And in the ancient cities, again, until the last 100, 150 years, were places that were really in the middle of the wilderness. So I think we had to be careful in being, in one sense we had to be very critical, but on the other sense we had to honor our tradition of cities. I mean, you go to a European city, you don't see a tree put anywhere. I mean, because that was enough out there. So I think we need to be careful, and I think perhaps suburbia is a sense of loss of nature that it has gone wrong. Some people go, I'm going to be out there wistful, but it's really, you have a lot of nature, but it's in the wrong, I would say it's in the wrong locations, but there is some sort of intuition that perhaps people have flee to suburbia in search of what has been lost, but maybe wrongly put. So we need to rethink about suburbia as what is telling us in the kind of hidden message, not the actualization of the thing, but what is it that people go there for, and perhaps go because of nature, but what other models we could have, and which is with a vertical city, I don't know what it is, but I think that's what we should look at.
It is an interesting.
I got 3 more on this side, 3 on that, and that'll be it. I have you, Perm, and young woman in here. But please respond, and then
I was just going to say that there is still this gulf, I think, in the design community between the notion of a city holding up kind of an Italian hill town as the ultimate sort of design idea, in contrast to a kind of emerging green city, and we have not overcome this in schools of architecture and design, starting to maybe, and finding kind of middle ground. But you're right. I mean, there is that longer urban tradition, and but there's a nature tradition as well. So we have to figure out how to weave them together, I think.
My name is Arturo Reynoso. I have this strong suspicion that this Mediterranean diet has to do with the ocean.
Yes.
That's part of the whole thing. I'm from the ocean. I could not live away from the ocean.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you have spoken a lot about the architecture, you've spoken a lot about the greens, but you haven't really concentrated on that. I just cannot live away from it. I travel a lot to the Midwest, and sometimes 2 hours of travel, and I think I'm seeing the ocean out there in the background, looking at the wheat fields.
Yeah.
And it's part of me. I could not live away from it. So do you have any studies that
Yes,
that,
I'm sure Alan knows about them as well, but Michael DePledge in the UK has just done a bunch of research on shorelines and coastal environments and the benefits they deliver, and I've got citations if you'd like to see. More generally, we live on the blue planet. 70% of our area, 80, is ocean. And so that's a huge potential there. I'm actually writing a book called Blue Urbanism, rather, and trying to, how do we foster emotional connection to the ocean? That's going to be essential if we're, as we move forward. Yeah.
There you go.
I really thank you. It's a fantastic series of presentations and discussion. I'd like to go to materiality, whereas much of the conversation has related to the vegetative materiality, but our geologists brought into our mind stone.
Sure.
So my question is really about the aesthetics of our urban environment. We're driven toward a machine-built environment, more and more of glass and steel. We're in a building, however, that is natural aesthetic of wood and stone. The urban environment of Jerusalem had one only criteria that the British set, which was everything must be built of Jerusalem stone. And today that's really one of the most beautiful created urban environments where we have the machine-driven aesthetic, which we know might be New York or might be Vancouver or this. I wonder what studies are being done about the visual materiality of our urban environment related to natural materials versus, I mean, I accept the wood and tree, but I'm talking about the built materiality of the built form. If you could tell us something about what's being done in that field.
Not a lot, and there should be. When we were doing our research, the Japanese have done some studies here. They've looked also at the amount of wood, for example, that there's also a sweet spot there. And essentially what they found was that if you had wood on the wall up to maybe approximately halfway up, that was your maximum in terms of sort of an aesthetic pleasure that was derived from it, right? Whereas if you went to 1970s circa split-level ranch and had the whole thing wood paneled, that was actually distressing to the subjects in these photographs. So they've done other studies of a similar vein where wood material in general is very, very pleasing aesthetically. But I haven't seen a lot, to be honest, on just like head-to-head, you know, which is better in terms of glass and stone. And it's a very important question. I think, I'm not an expert in this, but I know that there's some researchers who are looking at the fractals, the repetition in design, and whether or not, you know, that's from stone and so on. I'm not sure. But it's a great, great question. I think it should be more research.
Let me tell you the 5 buildings we did the experiment. They are sacred spaces, and all they are very material center. The Salk Institute and Ronchamp are the most contemporary buildings of the 5. Then Alhambra is another one, Chartres, and the Pantheon. So all these buildings have a strong embodiment, and you could say even monolithic quality in terms of materiality, in which also light plays a very important component. Those are very classical. Oh, Ronchamp is not classical, but in the sense of use of materiality. So there is something about, it's indirect, but I'm indirectly answering because I didn't look at that matter. But one of the challenges we have with these researchers is that we look at very particular, let's say, how, like you were saying, I'm just only that. But of course, we don't experience reality like that. We experience reality all this, but then scientifically we are forced to have these. So one of the challenges of designing these experiments is how to do it so it's scientifically valid, and yet it responds, especially for architects, you know, how you respond to the holistic quality as well. So it's a difficult thing to do.
Here, and then Doug up to Perm, please. Yeah.
I'm Janet here, family physician. I have a general comment or question. I think one has to be careful how one imparts significance to or how one interprets empirical data. And I think I heard you say, Julio, is it that the brain is not consciousness, and also the brain is not first person.
Yes.
First personness, it's third person at best. So when we look at MRIs and functional MRIs and MRAs and PET scans and we see blood flow and we see areas light up, we have to make sure that what we see is just correlative and not make the distinction between correlation and causation, which is very fashionable now, to talk about the difference between them. When we see the insula light up with pleasant scenes and we say, that must be the cause of it. We're just making a correlation.
without question. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's, I wouldn't want it to be sort of hung out there that this is causation. On the other hand, I think it's really encouraging that there's validation of what has been more sort of broadly described or intuitive and so on. And to me, what happens here is you start layering this in like a mosaic, a jigsaw puzzle that comes together, because when you then bring in the cortisol and you bring in the blood pressure and you bring in the separate research from epidemiology and you layer that in with research on gardening and horticultural therapy, it all then starts to take on greater meaning. The MRI studies to me would be almost meaningless if they weren't put into the framework of everything else, you know, green exercise, which we didn't even touch on, you know, that it's better than, you know, exercise itself in terms of motivation to subsequently engage in exercise. So, you know, again, that doesn't mean exercise is no good. It means potentially green exercise might have a public health place. So all this stuff layers in. But I'm really glad that you brought up that point, because I would never want to, you know, to have it hung out there.
But this is the direction that I think the Japanese are going, from observations to correlations to biological plausibility.
That's right.
Really going down this pathway.
But I'm not as positive as you that we'll find that functionality in more and more scans and deeper scans and more research.
No, I'm not that naive. I think this is a Trojan horse, actually. I'm constructing a Trojan horse to undo modernity in the places that need to be undone. The wall had to be torn down of modernity. And this is a Trojan horse, and that is the only way to penetrate the castle. It's with their language and their tools. No, because I don't want to lose certain part of modernity. I love modernity. I love a lot of stuff of it, but some things need to go. And the only way we're going to convince them, and it's not them and us, because I'm part of it, convince is to speak their language. I'm speaking your language because it's the only way I can communicate with you. I can speak my native language. But I had to trade off, okay? So we need to have some level of communication, and we need to speak their language to be able to communicate.
But all will always be a first-person experience. We won't be able to replicate that in brain.
There is first, second, and third person experiences. So I'm talking about third right now because it's experience. But yes.
Thank you. Perm and Chris.
This is a comment directed at a couple of things that Julio said. You said that there are two ways of searching for God. One is nature and the other is contemplative practice. And you also said that the latter is likely to fail.
Only two.
It's only two.
Can I change
modify that?
You said the latter is likely to fail given the time and effort required.
Yes.
And it's more difficult. So I'm wondering whether that difficulty is a natural way of things or whether it is one that is self-created, and it's perhaps self-created by a system of education. And I'll just say two things about it. One is that as children we have a natural ability for wonder and awe, and then we get educated. So perhaps education should really be about the preservation of innocence rather than the certification of sophistication. And a second thing is that we learn, we say, in order to understand. But what do we understand? What is the purpose of understanding? Is it to achieve perfect understanding? And that's an elusive goal, because we can perfectly understand only something that is lesser than us. We can never understand something that is greater than us. So perhaps we need to restructure the role of understanding to say that it is a bridge to achieving harmony. That's our ultimate goal. So perhaps we need to restructure our education system because we've created certain difficulties for ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that. Complete agreement with that.
Yeah.
Come back to Chris. We have one more here and two more here. And then I think we're off to lunch.
I think one of the beautiful things about today is that we have a variety of communities here in conversation. And I just want to connect with what you're talking from my community. So I'm an evangelical Christian, and put on the table some scripture and some theology. And very, very quickly that, well, the first thing is, you know the Genesis story, the garden, it's out in the garden, but the story actually ends in a city. But it's a very important city. It's described in Revelation. It's a garden city. because the tree of life is in the center of the city. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So maybe it's a byproduct today, I don't know. But for evangelicals, there's a connection there and something in our imagination to think through and converse about. The second thing was, in terms of our spiritual resources, we do have prayer, we have scripture, but we have heroes of the faith. And one of those is Solomon, who, by the way, we recognize as being very wise and deeply spiritual, connected to God. But we probably have lost the understanding that Scripture also describes Solomon as being wise in the ways of the trees and the birds, and that people came from around the world to sit at his knee to learn about the ways of nature. So, what I take about that is that Christian tradition has both a recognizable spiritual tradition that includes understanding creation, the ways of trees, birds, ecology.
Great. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah.
I remember the conversation I had with David, the head of the alternative medicine, and his wife is a rabbi. Yeah, Eisenberg. And his wife is rabbi, and he was relating this experience. He goes, yes, and she just gave a sermon about the Jews in exile, 40 days roaming the desert until they were quiet enough to hear the voice of God.
That's good. Yeah, that's very good. Nice.
Thanks. My name is Dr. Yue Zhuang, University of Zurich. A question for Alan. In line with your earlier comments, actually, would you consider including or excluding frightening effect of nature in your vision of a therapeutic environment or future cities? And how do you think the relation between well-being and spirituality? Thanks.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we always have to keep the frightening aspect front and center, because, and it's the same thing with, pets and animals. Not everyone's a dog lover. People have had, traumatic experiences with dogs. And then on the flip side, there's engage in an academic gardening program or after-school gardening or community gardening. You are subsequently more willing to literally eat your peas. And then that becomes another
broccoli,
public health variable, because public health variable is nutrition, well known. That reconnection to nature, in that seeing seed to plant, increases the way people eat in a healthy way. And then, of course, you can layer in the spiritual connection on top of that as well, quite easily. What I want to happen, ultimately, and that's why I know Dr. Spengler's, he's working diligently night and day to make this happen, is that for physicians to be able to say to their patients with chronic disease, with depression and anxiety, to be able to say, hey, I really need you to get outside. And very briefly, and I know I've taken up a lot of time in this one question, I apologize, but there's another study that we didn't talk about, and it was a study where mental health care providers did this psychotherapy in a nature-based setting, in an arboretum. And it was a 30% greater response rate compared to the psychotherapy that was conducted in a hospital setting, compared to the third arm of the study where they were told, okay, you guys go out in the community, find somebody that you like, and let's see how you do. So there's a therapeutic benefit for a healthcare provider, if they're willing and the weather's okay, to meet outside, especially for talk therapy, where you're just sitting on a park bench. There may be that added edge there as well. So,
okay, you still go outside, I think.
Well, yeah. Well,
that's
well,
we're too.
That's all.
The hunger pains are reaching all of us here. So one last question, please, and then we'll go on.
Thank you all so much.
I think it is.
This is just fantastic.
We can hear. No.
Yeah, hold it
Closer.
closer.
You've really sort of blown the cover off what was a more contained discussion yesterday, and so further to the ocean and this not just being about human beings, what about our sense of desolation and injustice at this coming extinction event? 50% of all of the species existing now. facing imminent extinction? Are there studies about, in your fields?
Well, we've got what Elizabeth Nesbitt, who is a psychologist in Canada. She's the one that tricked her students into taking the nature-based walk. They've actually done it a couple of times now. And she has found in provoking nature connectivity among these students, right, who again up front predicted there really wouldn't be much benefit from nature for me. That's a dangerous thing, because if we get to a place where folks don't recognize that nature may be beneficial, you've lost the point of reference. The signpost isn't there anymore. Yes, we'll all survive, we'll have our devices, we'll be fine. But what are we missing out on? And then how does that come into extinction? She refers to this as the happy path to sustainability, because it's better than the other messaging, which is doomsday scenarios. That doesn't affect change.
No.
But if you go the happy path, let people realize that nature has a medicinal feel to it, make you feel better, then that in turn creates pro-environmental change.
You know, the Australian National University does their sustainability program around delight, not fright.
That's it, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm going to conclude this. I'm going to thank you all.